Chapter 2238. Just as Xiao Chun and the girls were chatting in the courtyard, Xiao Wan rushed in. Xiao Chun could not help but smile bitterly at the sight of the little girl rushing into the courtyard. Just as Xiao Chun and the girls were chatting in the courtyard, Xiao Wan rushed in. Xiao Chun could not help but smile bitterly at the sight of the little girl rushing into the courtyard. In the past, although Xiao Wan was mischievous at home, at least Qin Shiru and the others were there to take care of her. Now, after entering the outer sect, she was free to do whatever she wanted. This little girl was getting wilder and wilder. Sure enough, looking at Xiao Wan's energetic appearance, 100 Flower Fairy said with a smile, "Girl, why are you so impetuous?" "Second mother, let me hear it." Xiao Wan didn't care about 100 Flower Fairy's teasing. She pounced on 100 Flower Fairy's body and pressed her ear against 100 Flower Fairy's belly. Not only 100 Flower Fairy, but Qin Shu, Tian Yu, Guling Yao, and Hongxiu also laughed when they saw Xiao Wan's behavior. Just like Xiao Chun, the girls didn't neglect Xiao Wan even though Qin Shu and 100 Flower Fairy were pregnant. They still treated her like their own daughter. Xiao Wan obviously felt this as well. Therefore, she didn't feel any jealousy towards her little brother and sister who were about to be born. Even with Xiao Wan's carefree personality, she was looking forward to the birth of her little brother and sister. Because of this, she would have 2 little followers in the future. Xiao Wan didn't feel any jealousy or worry. This was what Xiao Chun was happy to see. Xiao Chun didn't want the arrival of these 2 little guys to cause any misunderstandings in Xiao Wan's heart or create any estrangement between them. After watching Xiao Wan fool around for a while, Xiao Chun said, Wan, how have you been recently? Did you cause any trouble?" Xiao Wan didn't have any special status in the outer sect. Just like the other outer sect disciples, Xiao Wan needed to cultivate and complete missions. At the same time, she also needed to participate in all the outer sect assessments. She wouldn't have any special treatment just because she was his daughter. This was also something that Xiao Chun had specifically instructed him to do. Hearing Xiao Chen's words, Xiao Wan threw herself into Xiao Chen's arms and said coquettishly, "What trouble can I cause? Moreover, I'm first place in the outer court competition." Every once in a while, the outer court would hold a competition to test the progress of the outer court disciples during this period. Of course, Xiao Chun rarely paid attention to this. It was all handled by the deacons of the outer court. When he heard that Xiao Wan had won first place in the outer sect competition, Xiao Chun laughed and scolded her. "You little girl, I don't even need to think to know that you won first place in the outer sect because everyone let you win, right?" "Who said so? I really won first place with my own strength. If you don't believe me, Father, you can ask the deacon of the outer court." Xiao Wan refused to let it go. In fact, Xiao Chun was very clear about Xiao Wan's strength. With her extremely high cultivation talent, Xiao Wan only needed to put in a little effort to achieve unimaginable progress. This was the difference. Moreover, with Xiao Wan's strength, she was indeed one of the best in the outer court. She liked it when Xiao Chun praised her. Thus, she couldn't resist Xiao Wan's coaxing and pestering. In the end, Xiao Chun smiled and said, Okay. My Wan is the best, okay?" Every time Xiao Chun performed, Xiao Wan would be very happy. When the family was together, they seemed to be very happy. This was what Xiao Chun had been looking for all along. After struggling in the Great Thousand World for so many years, Xiao Chun could finally say that he had the ability to protect his family. Time passed day by day, and in the blink of an eye, a few months had passed. As time passed, Qin Shiru and 100 Flower Fairy's bellies grew bigger and bigger. Soon, it was time for them to give birth. Strangely enough, Qin Shiru and 100 Flower Fairy were pregnant almost at the same time. Now, they were giving birth at the same time. On this day, in Xiao Chen's cave residence, Xiao Chun, Long Qing, Nangong Wan, Zhou Song, Wu Huan, and the other higher-ups of the sword sect gathered together. In the courtyard, Xiao Chun was nervously pacing back and forth. The reason why Xiao Chun was so nervous was naturally because Qin Shiru and 100 Flower Fairy were giving birth. He couldn't help but worry. Seeing Xiao Chun like this, Nangong Guan smiled and said, "Junior brother, you've been pacing back and forth for almost an hour. Don't worry, it'll be fine. Qin Shiru and Hundred Flower Fairy were both martial artists. Logically speaking, they shouldn't be in any danger. After all, martial artist physiques were far superior to ordinary people. There shouldn't be any difficulties in giving birth and dying. But even though he knew this, Xiaoqin couldn't help but worry. Perhaps this was how a husband and father felt. Hearing Nangongwan's words, Xiaoqin smiled bitterly and said, "Senior brother, Sai, how can I not worry? It's been almost 4 hours." It had indeed been almost 4 hours since Qin Shiru and Hundred Flower Fairy had started giving birth. How could Xiaoqin not worry? Hearing Xiaoqin's words, Nangongwan smiled bitterly and didn't say anything. As a father, Nangongwan naturally understood Xiaoqin's feelings. Xiaoqin had never felt that time was passing so slowly. Every minute and every second felt like torture to him. Just as Xiaoqin was getting more and more anxious, the sound of a child crying suddenly came from the room. Hearing this sound, Xiaoqin's face lit up and he hurriedly strode into the room. Inside the room, Qin Shiru and Hundred Flower Fairy's faces were somewhat pale. However, they didn't seem to be in any danger. Beside them, Qing Yao, Qing Luo, Fei Mei, and Enlan were also sweating profusely. Fortunately, both mother and child were safe in the end. Seeing Xiaoqin enter the room, Qing Yao and Qing Luo carried the 2 crying babies to Xiaoqin and said with a smile, "Young master, it's 2 fat boys." After following Xiaoqin for so many years, Qing Yao and Qing Luo clearly weren't that restrained. Normally, they would speak very casually with Xiaoqin. Hearing their words, Xiaoqin was also very happy. He hugged the 2 chubby boys in his arms and looked at the 2 children in his arms. These were Xiaoqin's sons. Strangely enough, the 2 boys were originally crying nonstop. However, after being hugged by Xiaoqin, they quickly stopped crying. Moreover, their big eyes were curiously sizing up Xiaoqin. It was as if they were saying, "Is this guy daddy?" Being sized up by the 2 boys, Xiaoqin was overjoyed. He laughed heartily and carried them to Qin Shiru and Hundred Flower Fairy's side. Looking at their children, Qin Shiru and Hundred Flower Fairy both revealed benevolent expressions. This was the instinct of a mother. Even Qin Shiru, who always gave people a cold feeling, appeared extremely gentle at this moment. Chapter 2239. Looking at the 2 chubby boys lying beside Qin Shiru and Fairy of 100 Flowers, Xiaoqin couldn't help but smile. However, Qin Shiru and Fairy of 100 Flowers also needed a rest, so Xiaoqin didn't stay for too long. After comforting the 2 girls, he quickly left the room. After all, Qing Yao, Tianyu, Guling Yao, and Hongxiu were taking care of him. There was no need for Xiaoqin here. When Xiaoqin returned to the courtyard, Nangongguan and the others, as well as Long Qing, all smiled and said, "Congratulations, Sect Master, for having a son." Qin Shiru and Fairy of 100 Flowers had both given birth to 2 chubby boys for him. This made Xiaoqin very happy, so when he heard everyone's congratulations, Xiaoqin laughed heartily. After laughing, Xiaoqin directly invited everyone to drink to their heart's content. When they arrived at another courtyard in the cave residence, everyone sat together, drinking and chatting. As they chatted, Long Qing looked at Xiaoqin and said, "Little brother, have you thought of names?" Of course, Xiaoqin had already thought of names for the 2 chubby boys of Qin Shiru and Fairy of 100 Flowers. In response to Long Qing's question, Xiaoqin smiled faintly and said, "Haha, let's call them Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao. The older one would be called Xiao Yao, while the younger one would be called Xiao Lao." Hearing this, Long Qing nodded slightly. Then, Xiaoqin smiled mysteriously at Long Qing. "Second sister, I plan to have these 2 boys become apprentices to you and Big Brother. What do you think?" Long Qing and Xinyuan Ling were Xiaoqin's sworn siblings. Logically speaking, the 2 of them were Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao's godfather and godmother. However, Xiaoqin had the intention to have the 2 boys become apprentices to the 2 of them. Long Qing didn't object to this and readily nodded in agreement. Thus, Xiaoqin decided to have Xiao Lao become Long Qing's apprentice and Xiao Yao become Xin Yuanling's apprentice. However, Xin Yuanling wasn't in the sword sect right now, so they could only wait for him to return. Xiao Chun was overjoyed at the birth of his children. Everyone drank to their heart's content. Until the next day, the birth of Xiao Yao and Xiao Luo to the entire Swords Gate was a joyous occasion. And these two little guys, to put it bluntly, they were indeed born with a golden spoon in their mouths. From the moment they were born, they were destined to have a noble status. As their father, Xiao Chun gave these two boys a perfect family and background. At least in the Great Thousand World, Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao could be said to be the top princes. Thinking about it, how many people in the Great Thousand World could be compared to the princes of the Sword Sect? These two boys were indeed very fortunate. Not only did their family background defy the heavens, but Xiao Chen's family also doted on these two boys. This was especially so for the two elders, Xiao Qing and Bai Ruyue. They were afraid that they would melt in their mouths and fall out of their hands. In addition, Gu Lingyao, Tianyu, and Hongxiu also treated these two boys as their own. After so many years of getting along, the relationship between these girls had long been like that of sisters. Therefore, Qin Shu and Fairy of 100 Flowers children naturally treated them like their own children. They were doted on by everyone. This was the result of their father, Xiao Chen's hard work. With the company of his sons and the Great Thousand World's temporary peace, Xiao Chen naturally enjoyed a few rare years of familial happiness. The matters of the Sword Sect developed in an orderly manner. The system of martial arts academies in the Sword Mansion was also gradually established. 5 years passed in the blink of an eye. At this time, within the Sword Mansion, almost every city had a martial arts academy. These martial arts academies would recruit a batch of students every year. There is no need for expensive tuition fees. In fact, even ordinary people could afford it. Of course, these martial arts academies only taught the basics of cultivation. However, even so, it was enough to make many ordinary people who had no cultivation extremely excited. At the very least, they now had the possibility of stepping into the martial path and becoming a martial artist. Xiao Chen's dream was for everyone to be able to cultivate. He didn't ask for their cultivation to be high, but at least they could prolong their lives and strengthen their bodies. After 5 years of hard work, this goal seemed to be slowly being achieved, at least within the Sword Mansion. Moreover, in these 5 years, Xiao Yao and Xiao Luo had also slowly grown up. Although they were not yet at the age of cultivation, because they had all kinds of spiritual treasures of heaven and earth to strengthen their bodies since they were young, the physical quality of these two boys was already very good. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao's starting point was much higher than that of their father, Xiao Chun. Almost from a young age, they started to enjoy the best cultivation environment and various treasures of heaven and earth. As for Xiao Chun, in these 5 years, Xiao Chun naturally wouldn't be idle. His cultivation had already reached the peak of the Tao realm. A month ago, Xiao Chun also started to go into seclusion to try to break through to the end realm. Xiao Chun going into seclusion to try to break through to the end realm was a huge matter for the Sword Sect. Moreover, in these 5 years of peace, the sect leaders of the 10 Lingtian sects like Xiao Xiao, Dao Ju, and Yang Chun were all on the verge of breaking through to the end realm. Today, all the geniuses were about to break through to the end realm. At such a time, if anyone failed to break through to the end realm, they would be pulled apart by others. This was why the Sword Sect paid a lot of attention to Xiao Chen's breakthrough. After all, there was a huge difference between the end realm and the Tao realm. Although Xiao Chun and the other geniuses were strong enough to fight against end realm experts of the Tao realm, it was still impossible for them to fight against end realm experts. However, since they were all geniuses, it was obviously impossible for them to fight opponents who were of a higher cultivation level than them. Once they failed to break through, it would mean that the gap between them and their opponents would be widened. A month passed, and Xiao Chun still didn't make any moves. As for the Shrine's Hall leader, Shun Hui, it was said that he had successfully broken through to the end realm a day ago, becoming the first person to break through to the end realm out of all the geniuses. Since Shun Hui had already broken through, Nangong Guan and the others naturally became more and more anxious. They all hoped that Xiao Chun could successfully break through. On this day, in Xiao Chen's cave, Qin Shi and the other girls sat together. Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao were playing at the side. Looking at the two kids, Qin Shi said worriedly, "It has already been a month. I wonder how my husband is doing." Xiao Chun had already been in seclusion for a month, but there was still no news from him. Hearing this, 100-Flower Fairy was also worried. However, at this moment, an aura suddenly surged into the sky from the secret room where Xiao Chun was in seclusion. The appearance of this aura was quickly sensed by the experts of the Sword Sect. Nangong Guan, Zhou Song, Wu Huan, and the other Vice Sect Masters' cave dwellings all had joyous expressions on their faces as they excitedly said, "The Sect Master broke through." Chapter 2240. Sensing the aura coming from Xiao Chen's cave, Nangong Guan and the other Vice Sect leaders were all extremely excited. This aura clearly indicated that he had stepped into the End Realm. In other words, Xiao Chun had successfully broken through to the End Realm. Sensing the aura coming from Xiao Chen's cave, Nangong Guan and the other Vice Sect leaders were all extremely excited. This aura clearly indicated that he had stepped into the End Realm. In other words, Xiao Chun had successfully broken through to the End Realm. Xiao Chen's success in breaking through to the End Realm allowed Nangong Guan and the other Vice Sect leaders' hearts to finally drop. After all, after Shun Hui's breakthrough, they were really worried that Xiao Chun would fail. If that happened, the impact on the Sword Sect would be too great. Luckily, Xiao Chun didn't disappoint them and successfully broke through to the End Realm. They hurried over to Xiao Chen's cave. Outside the secret room where Xiao Chun was cultivating, Nangong Guan and the others, as well as Qin Shi, 100-Flower Fairy, Xiao Yao, and Xiao Lao, were all anxiously waiting. Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao hadn't started cultivating yet, but they could feel the terrifying aura coming from the secret room. Being held in the arms of Qin Shi and 100-Flower Fairy, Xiao Yao said in a daze, "Mom, is Dad inside?" "In. Dad will come out soon." Hearing this, Qin Shi smiled. Ever since Xiao Yao was born, Qin Shi wasn't as cold as before. Especially when facing his son, he was like a loving mother. Under everyone's waiting, the door to the secret room was opened, and Xiao Chun slowly walked out. Because he had just broken through, he wasn't able to control his aura very well. However, when they saw Xiao Chun, Nangong Guan and the others all revealed a relieved smile. Seeing that everyone was present, Xiao Chun smiled and said, "I did not disappoint you." After successfully breaking through to End Realm, Xiao Chun heaved a sigh of relief. At the same time, when they saw Xiao Chun, Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao broke free from their mother's embrace and walked in front of Xiao Chun, wanting Xiao Chun to hug them. The two brothers, who were already 5 years old, were extremely dependent on Xiao Chun. Seeing this, Xiao Chun smiled and hugged the two brothers at the same time. Xiao Chen's breakthrough allowed the Sword Sect to heave a sigh of relief. At the same time, it also made the other prodigies who had yet to break through feel pressured. Now, out of all the geniuses and monsters, Shun Hui and Xiao Chun had successfully broken through to the End Realm. Next, it was up to the others. In the next month, Xiao Chun had been consolidating his cultivation realm. During this month, Dao Ju, Li Chun, Xiao Xiao, Yang Chun, and Yin Sheng all broke through to the End Realm. The various prodigies had all stepped into the End Realm. This also meant that they were truly standing at the top of the Great Thousand World. With the cultivation realms of these geniuses, as long as the sovereigns didn't appear, no one would be able to threaten them. Similarly, End Realm experts wouldn't be a match for these geniuses. A month passed in the blink of an eye. Xiao Chun had also completely stabilized his cultivation realm. However, it wasn't peaceful for long. Very quickly, something big happened in the 10,000 Weapon Manor. It was said that an ancient relic had appeared, and it had already attracted many cultivators from the Great Thousand World. Originally, Xiao Chun didn't pay much attention to the appearance of an ancient relic in the 10,000 Weapon Manor. He could just casually send an expert from the Sword Sect over. However, according to the news that was sent back, The ancient relic that appeared in the 10,000 weapon manor had reincarnation energy drifting out. Based on speculation, it should be related to the reincarnation emperor. Since it was related to the reincarnation emperor, Xiaochen immediately thought of Xian Yuan Ling. Xian Yuan Ling had left for many years, and there had been no news of him. What Xian Yuan Ling had told Xiaochen back then was to head to the reincarnation emperor's place of inheritance and obtain the complete inheritance of the reincarnation emperor. Now, the ancient relic that appeared in the 10,000 weapon manor had reincarnation energy drifting out. It was very likely related to Xian Yuan Ling. Since it was related to Xian Yuan Ling, Xiao Chun naturally couldn't ignore it. Moreover, it was said that the Heavenly Eam Tower also attached great importance to the ancient relic and had already sent many experts over. In the main hall, Xiao Chun sat on the main seat, and below him, Song Xing told Xiao Chun all the news that he had received. After hearing Song Xing's words, Xiao Chun muttered softly, "I'm afraid that Big Brother is now in the ancient relic." All the signs indicated that Xian Yuan Ling was most likely in the ancient relic, and this ancient relic should be the place where the reincarnation emperor had fallen. With this thought, Xiao Chun decided to head over personally. After all the major forces were very interested in the ancient relic, and the 10,000 weapon manor was the territory of the Heavenly Eam Tower. Xiao Chun was worried that Xian Yuan Ling would be in danger, so he naturally couldn't sit back and do nothing. Seeing that Xiao Chun had decided to head over personally, Song Xing was slightly taken aback. "Sect Master, are you going over personally? Why don't you let me go?" In Song Xing's opinion, this matter didn't require Xiao Chun to head over personally. However, Xiao Chun directly shook his head and refused. "This matter concerns Big Brother's safety, so I have to head over personally. Moreover, the Heavenly Eam Tower doesn't have a good relationship with my sword sect. I'm afraid that they will suddenly attack. If the ancient relic appeared in the territory of the Moon Palace or the Saber sect, Xiao Chun might not be so nervous. However, since it appeared in the territory of the 10,000 weapon manor, Xiao Chun had no choice but to make sufficient preparations. After all, the relationship between the Heavenly Eam Tower and the Sword Sect wasn't friendly. In the past few years, both sides had broken out several small-scale conflicts, but they were all left unsettled in the end. The Heavenly Eam Tower had no choice but to guard against them. Moreover, Xiao Chun understood Yin Sheng's methods of doing things very well. Just like his master, Yin Litian, they would do anything to achieve their goals. Xiao Chun was determined to personally head over to the 10,000 weapon manor. Song Xing didn't say anything about this. After all, Xiao Chun was the sect master. If he wanted to do something, Song Xing naturally couldn't stop him. After deciding to personally head over to the 10,000 weapon manor, Xiao Chun returned home and told Qin Shiru and the other girls about this matter. Qin Shiru and the other girls didn't stop Xiao Chun, but they repeatedly reminded him to be careful. After bidding farewell to his family, Xiao Chun brought Lin Qing, Song Xing, Li Ku, the 3 deputy sect masters, and the 10 sword leaders to the 10,000 weapon manor early the next morning. There weren't many people, but all of them were experts from the sword sect. Actually, Xiao Chun was not very interested in the treasures in the ancient ruins during this trip to the 1,000 weapon residence. After all, with the current strength of the Sword's Gate, ordinary treasures were no longer of interest to them. Xiao Chun's only goal was to ensure Xian Yuan Ling's safety. As for other things, Xiao Chun didn't think too much about it. They rushed all the way to the 10,000 weapon manor. Because the 10,000 weapon manor and the sword sect were neighbors, Xiao Chun and the rest entered the 10,000 weapon manor in a short time. "Sect Master, I heard that the shrines have also sent people over. Moreover, it seems like 2 deputy palace masters are personally leading the team." After entering the 10,000 weapon manor, Song Xing received a sound transmission talisman. He immediately reported the contents of the sound transmission talisman to Xiao Chun, begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2241. The shrines had also sent someone over. Upon hearing this, Xiao Chun nodded slightly, but did not say much. The group continued on their way. In the next 2 hours, Song Xing received several voice transmission talismans. According to the contents of the voice transmission talismans, Song Xing also told Xiao Chun that in addition to the shrines, the Moon Palace, Saber Sect, and even the Heavenly Sect had sent people over to the 10,000 Weapon Mansion. Other than the Dan Valley and the Heavenly Policy Mansion, the rest of the 10 Great Lingtian sects had basically sent people over. It seemed like everyone valued this ancient relic very much. However, thinking about it, the Reincarnation Emperor was at least in the top 5 in the history of the Great Thousand World. He was one of the most powerful emperors. As for the relic that he had left behind, there must be a lot of treasures. Moreover, the most important thing was that the Reincarnation Emperor had originally comprehended the reincarnation doctrine. This was also the reason why everyone valued this relic so much. Very few people could comprehend the mysteries of the reincarnation doctrine. Not only the 10 Great Lingtian sects, but the other great sects had also sent people over to see if they could take advantage of the situation. Xiao Chun was not in the mood to pay attention to this. Anyway, Xiao Chun had personally come this time for Xin Yuanling. He was worried that Xin Yuanling would be in danger, so Xiao Chun had specially rushed over. As for the treasures in the relic, Xiao Chun did not care and had no intention of fighting for them. Of course, with Xin Yuanling's character, if he was in the relic, he would have already obtained the treasures. Therefore, Xiao Chun did not need to fight for anything at all. According to the news that was sent back, the relic had not truly opened yet. It was estimated that they would only be able to enter after a period of time. Therefore, after entering the 10,000 Weapon Mansion, Xiao Chun and the rest were not in a hurry. This was because even if they arrived at the relic, Xiao Chun would not be able to enter at this time. As for forcing their way in, it was not impossible. As long as an emperor took action, they would definitely be able to forcefully break the restrictions around the ancient relic. However, in doing so, it was very likely that the ancient relic would be destroyed. After all, under normal circumstances, the restrictions around the ancient relic could not be forcefully broken. Otherwise, the relic would likely self-destruct. At that time, the gains would not make up for the losses. There was no hurry. As long as the relic had not completely opened, Xin Yuanling. Along the way, Xiao Chun and the rest. After all, he was the sword sex. If his identity was exposed in the Heavenly Yin Tower, there would be a lot of trouble. After all, he was not exposed his identity. If he was exposed. Of course, Xiao Chun was not afraid that Yin Sheng would attack him. Unless Yin Sheng was absolutely sure that he could kill Xiao Chun, Yin Sheng would not attack Xiao Chun so easily. It was just that the Heavenly Yin Tower and the Sword Sect were evenly matched. It was almost impossible for Yin Sheng to have full confidence in killing him. Therefore, Xiao Chun was not afraid of Yin Sheng. They arrived at the closest city to the Reincarnation Emperor's relic. It was called Jinluan City. The city was not big. In the Great Thousand World, cities of this size could be said to be everywhere. Jinluan City was not very famous. However, this time, with the relic of the Reincarnation Emperor, the small Jinluan City became lively. People from all the major forces gathered in Jinluan City. With so many forces coming from Jinluan City and gathering in one place, it naturally made Jinluan City extremely chaotic. They directly entered the city. In the city, the Sword Sect had already prepared a residence for Xiao Chun. At a glance, Jinluan City was simply overcrowded. Not only were people from major forces, but many independent cultivators had also rushed to Jinluan City. They wanted to see if they could pick up some scraps. The city governor's office of Jinluan City naturally could not do anything about it. As a small city, the city governor's office naturally could not control all the major forces. Not to mention Lingtian's sect, like the Sword Sect. Any major force was not something the city governor's office of Jinluan City could contend with. At this time, the city governor's office of Jinluan City could only rely on the Heavenly Yin Tower. However, the news had already been sent to the Heavenly Yin Tower, but the experts of the Heavenly Yin Tower had not arrived. They did not intend to cause trouble. However, sometimes trouble would provoke you even if you did not want to. They walked all the way to the residential area that had already been prepared. Due to the crowd on the road, Xiao Chun and the others bumped into several disciples of the temple. As disciples of the shrines, these people were naturally used to being arrogant. At this time, when they met Xiao Chun, they had no intention of giving way. Moreover, they were cursing. "Get lost. Can't you see that we are from the shrines?" In the Great Thousand World, there were not many forces that dared to provoke the shrines. Moreover, Xiao Chen's group was not wearing the sword sect's uniform. Therefore, these disciples of the shrines were naturally fearless. Hearing this, Xiao Chun frowned slightly and said indifferently, "Slap them." Following Xiao Chen's words, a sword body of the sword sect respectfully responded. Then, in a flash, he disappeared from his original position. Subsequently, a crisp sound of slapping was heard. Several disciples of the Sacred Hall were sent flying with a single slap from the head swordsman. After that, Xiao Chun did not even bother to look at those people and walked away. Xiao Chun naturally did not care about a few disciples of the shrines. Not to mention that they were only disciples of the shrines. Even if the deputy hall master of the shrines came, Xiao Chun would not care about them. In the Sage Palace, the only one who could stand on equal footing with Xiao Chun was Shunhui. Others were afraid of the shrines, but it did not mean that the sword sect would be afraid of them. Moreover, Xiao Chun was the sect master of the sword sect. How could these insignificant disciples casually insult him? However, when they saw Xiao Chen's group send the disciples of the shrines flying with a slap and then leave, the people around them shook their heads and said, "Do these people not know the identity of the shrines?" I think so. Otherwise, they would definitely not dare to make a move. They even dared to hit the disciples of the shrines. Everyone thought that Xiao Chun and his group were dead meat. After all, what was the shrines? They were one of the 10 great Lingtian sects. The people around them discussed. At the same time, the few disciples of the shrines who were sent flying previously stood up shakily. The leader covered his face and said with rage in his eyes, "You're courting death. Follow them. I'll go back and look for the elders." The sword body who attacked earlier was obviously of the Dao realm cultivation base. His strength was far stronger than these few disciples. However, so what? He was merely a Dao realm expert. If the shrines wanted to kill him, it would be as easy as killing an ant. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2242. One of the disciples secretly followed Xiao Chen's group, while the others returned to ask the shrine's elders for help. One of the disciples secretly followed Xiao Chen's group, while the others returned to ask the shrine's elders for help. As disciples of the shrines, these people were naturally proud and arrogant. They were used to being arrogant. After all, with the strength of the shrines, who would dare to attack them? Along the way, Song Xing whispered to Xiao Chun, who was beside him, "Lord, do you need me to deal with this?" Song Xing could easily sense that a disciple of the shrines was following them. However, Xiao Chun smiled and shook his head. No need. To be honest, Xiao Chun was not interested in these disciples of the shrines at all, because they were too weak. He could not be bothered with them at all. However, this disciple of the shrines did not know about this at all. He was following Xiao Chen's group, thinking that he was well hidden. They arrived at the residence that had been prepared in advance. It was a courtyard that was not too big. Xiao Chen did not care much about it. After all, he could not stay in Jinluan City for too long. After confirming where Xiao Chun and the others were staying, the disciple of the shrines quickly turned back. At the same time, in the courtyard where the shrines were staying, several disciples were standing respectfully in front of 2 deputy hall masters of the shrines. On this trip to Jinluan City, 2 deputy hall masters of the shrines led the team. However, as the hall master, Shunhui did not come in person. They exaggerated the previous incident. In any case, from the words of these disciples, Xiao Chen's group was simply heinous and did not take the shrine seriously at all. After hearing these words, one of the deputy hall masters said with a gloomy face, "They are courting death. I want to see who dares to not take the shrine seriously." One of the deputy palace masters seemed a little angry, but the other said, "Look at the big picture. Don't cause trouble. Everyone had come here for the ancient ruins. There was no benefit in stirring up trouble for no reason. One of the two deputy palace masters was prepared to teach Xiao Chun and the others a lesson, while the other felt that it was better to avoid trouble and not lose the big picture for a small matter. Hearing the advice of the deputy shrines, who was about to teach Xiao Chun and his group a lesson, said with a sullen face, "A bunch of random people dare to disrespect us shrines. If we don't teach them a lesson, how can we shrines have any face left? Don't worry, nothing will happen." He didn't listen to his companion's advice at all. Perhaps in the eyes of this deputy palace master, teaching Xiao Chun and his group a lesson was simply a trivial matter. It wasn't worth worrying about at all. Because of this person's character, the other deputy palace master didn't say anything more after thinking about it. Although he didn't want to cause trouble, with the strength of the shrines, it was not a problem to teach a bunch of random people a lesson. Therefore, the deputy palace master didn't say anything more and chose to acquiesce. Seeing this, the hot-tempered deputy palace master immediately stood up and said to the disciples in front of him, "Let's go. Take me there. I want to see who dares to disrespect us shrines." After saying that, the group directly left the residence and went straight to the courtyard where Xiao Chun and the others were. In the courtyard, Xiao Chun, Song Xing, and the others were sitting together. There wasn't the slightest trace of worry on their faces. At the same time, the courtyard door was directly kicked open. Then, the deputy palace master of the shrines strode in with the disciples from before. They were extremely arrogant and didn't put Xiao Chun and the others in their eyes. Looking at the few people striding in, a cold light flashed in Xiao Chun's eyes. However, before Xiao Chun could speak, Song Xing and Lin Xing stood up and took a step forward. Their figures instantly blocked the path of the shrines. The originally angry deputy palace master of the shrines was clearly stunned when he saw Song Xing and Lin Xing. From his expression, he seemed to have recognized Song Xing and Lin Xing. As the deputy palace master of the shrines, he naturally recognized Song Xing and Lin Xing. After all, the two of them were the deputy sect masters of the sword sect. It would be strange if he didn't recognize them. Facing the deputy palace master of the shrines being stunned, Song Xing sneered and said, What do you shrines mean by this?" They were both end realm experts, and there wasn't any difference in status. Song Xing naturally wouldn't be afraid of this deputy palace master of the shrines. Hearing Song Xing's words, the deputy palace master of the shrines also fiercely glared at the disciples behind him. It was obvious that he was blaming them. Didn't they say that they were a bunch of mobs? How could they be from the sword sect? In the past, the shrines might have been able to look down on the sword sect. However, the current sword sect wasn't something that the shrines dared to look down on. Even the heavenly sect was destroyed by the sword sect. If it wasn't for the survival of the Dragon Palace, how could the heavenly sect still exist in this world? The sword sect had the confidence to not fear the shrines. However, since they were already here, for the sake of the shrine's face, they naturally couldn't leave with their tails between their legs. Thus, the deputy palace master of the shrines also said in a deep voice, "Isn't the sword sect going too far? What's the meaning of beating up our shrine's disciples for no reason?" For the sake of the shrine's face, they naturally couldn't leave with their tails between their legs. However, hearing this, Song Xing coldly looked at the disciples of the shrines and said indifferently, "It seems like you guys aren't telling the truth. Do you know the consequences of doing so?" They didn't expect Xiao Chen's group to be from the sword sect. Moreover, Song Xing and Lin Xing were both deputy sect masters of the sword sect. At this moment, hearing Song Xing's words, the disciples' faces became incomparably ugly. They naturally knew the consequences of doing so. If this caused a conflict between the two sides, the consequences were far from what they could bear. Hearing Song Xing's words, the deputy sect master of the shrines wasn't stupid. He quickly realized that something was wrong. It was obvious that the truth was somewhat different from what the disciples beside him had said. He cursed in his heart, but now it was too late to back down. However, what the deputy sect master didn't expect was that after Song Xing's words, Xiao Chun, who wasn't far away, spoke softly without raising his head. "Song Xing, take him down, and let Shen Hui personally go to the sword sect to take him back. Hearing Xiao Qin's words, the deputy sect master of the shrine's face instantly darkened. What was the meaning of this? Wasn't this a little too arrogant? Looking in the direction of the voice, the deputy sect master was stunned when he saw the calm face of Xiao Qun. Naturally, he had seen Xiao Qun before. He didn't expect that the sect master of the sword sect would actually appear here. For a moment, the deputy sect master couldn't help but feel nervous. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2243. If the deputy palace master of the shrines could still maintain his composure when facing Song Xing, then when facing Xiao Qun, he couldn't help but feel nervous. One must know that Xiao Qun was the sect master of the sword sect. His status was on the same level as Shun Hui's. Moreover, Xiao Qin's cultivation had already broken through to the end realm. The deputy palace master knew very well what it meant for a monster like Xiao Qun to break through to the end realm. He had personally seen how strong Shun Hui was after breaking through to the end realm. He was definitely the strongest person below the Emperor realm. Since Xiao Qun could be on the same level as Shun Hui, he definitely wouldn't be weak. The deputy palace master didn't expect Xiao Qun to actually appear in Jinluan City. The deputy palace master unconsciously swallowed his saliva. He looked at Xiao Qun with a serious expression and said, "Sect Master Xiao Qun, this matter." His attitude was obviously completely different from before. Thinking about it, this deputy palace master naturally didn't dare to be disrespectful in front of Xiao Qun, let alone be arrogant. He wanted to explain, but before he could finish, Xiao Qun interrupted him rudely. "Are you trying to say that this matter is a misunderstanding?" Xiao Qun had already guessed what this deputy sect leader wanted to say. In response, Xiao Qun sneered in his heart. Upon hearing these words, the deputy hall leader repeatedly nodded his head in agreement. At this point, what else could he do other than say that it was a misunderstanding? Seeing the deputy palace master nod repeatedly, Xiao Qun said with an indifferent expression, "Is it just a misunderstanding?" Kicking down the courtyard door and walking in angrily was clearly an affront to Xiao Qun. Moreover, those disciples were so disrespectful to Xiao Qun just now. It was obvious that Xiao Qun wanted an explanation. He also understood Xiao Qin's meaning. So when he heard this, the deputy palace master gritted his teeth. He lowered his head and said to Xiao Qun, "Sect Master Xiao Qun is magnanimous. I was reckless today. I hope Sect Master Xiao Qun can forgive me this time." He had no choice but to lower his head and admit his mistake. Otherwise, this deputy palace master knew that it would be difficult for him to walk out safely. Moreover, Shenhui didn't come personally this time, so in front of Xiao Qun, he had to lower his head. He didn't make things difficult for this deputy palace master of the shrines. When he heard this, Xiao Qun said indifferently, "Xiao Qun, get lost." Similarly, he didn't want to complicate matters. When he heard Xiao Qin's words, the deputy palace master immediately left with his people. He didn't want to stay here for even a second longer. He left Xiao Qin's place in an extremely sorry state. However, because of this, the deputy palace master also received an extremely important piece of information. Xiao Qun had actually come to Jinluan City personally. When he returned to the residence of the shrines and the other shrines with a gloomy face, another deputy palace master asked curiously, "What's wrong?" His face was so gloomy that it was about to drip water. Seeing this, the deputy palace master told him the truth about Xiao Qun. When he heard that Xiao Qun had actually come to Jinluan City personally, the other deputy palace master fell in a deep thought. After a long while, he said, "I'm afraid this matter needs to be reported to the palace master." Xiao Qun had personally come to Jinluan City. This was no small matter. After all, with Xiao Qin's status, every move he made now could be said to be enough to change the situation of the Great Thousand World. Hence, there was no room for carelessness. They decided to report the news of Xiao Qin's appearance in Jinluan City to Shenhui. Immediately, the two deputy palace masters took out their voice-transmitting talismans and sent a message to Shenhui. At the shrines, Shun Hui was lazily leaning against a pavilion surrounded by a few beautiful women. Suddenly, a bright light flashed past and directly entered the space between Shun Hui's eyebrows. Immediately, a smile appeared on Shun Hui's face. He chuckled and said, "Xiao Chun has personally gone to Jinluan City? Haha, interesting. That's Yin Sheng's territory." Obviously, this voice-transmitting talisman was sent by the two deputy palace masters in Jinluan City. They told Xin Hui about Xiao Chen's appearance in Jinluan City. After learning that Xiao Chun had actually personally appeared in Jinluan City, Xin Hui was curious. At the same time, he also had a premonition that the ancient relic this time would most likely be very interesting. This was because the 10,000 Weapons Mansion was the territory of the Heavenly Yin Tower. Furthermore, Xiao Chun had personally brought people into the 10,000 Weapons Mansion. This was something that could not be ignored. A slight move in one hair would affect the whole body. Xin Hui smiled slightly. Immediately after, he was silent for a moment. Then he took out a voice-transmitting talisman and told Yin Sheng about this matter. Currently, the 10 great Lingtian sects, the shrines, the Heavenly Yin Tower, and the He-Tian Mansion were considered to be in one camp. The Sword Sect, the Lunar Palace, and the Heavenly Policy Mansion were in another camp. Other than that, the Saber Sect and the Dan Valley were somewhat neutral. Hence, in terms of relationship, Shun Hui was naturally more inclined towards the Heavenly Yin Tower. Hence, without much hesitation, Shun Hui passed this news to Yin Sheng. Looking at Shun Hui's smile, a beautiful woman at the side put her arm around Shun Hui's shoulder intimately and said gently, "Husband, what happened?" "It's nothing." Hearing this, Shun Hui smiled slightly. However, an inexplicable light flashed in his eyes. In Shun Hui's opinion, Jinluan City would probably be very interesting this time. Xiao Chun had personally appeared in Jinluan City. How would Yin Sheng deal with this? Would he directly start a war with the Sword Sect? As he thought about this, Xin Hui also replied to the two deputy hall masters of the shrines. He bluntly told them not to provoke Xiao Chen again and to wait for the Heavenly Shadow Tower's response. In any case, the news had already been passed to Yin Sheng. Next, it would depend on how Yin Sheng would deal with this. For the time being, Xin Hui did not want to offend Xiao Chun. Hence, he did not take any substantial action. In the Heavenly Yin Tower, Yin Sheng also quickly received Shun Hui's message. After learning that Xiao Chun had actually appeared in Jinluan City, a cold look flashed in Yin Sheng's eyes. It could be said that he and Xiao Chun were old rivals. Back then, in the Wood Realm, Yin Sheng had been defeated by Xiao Chun. After that, in all these years in the Great Thousand World, although the two of them had not exchanged blows, Yin Sheng had never forgotten his defeat in the Wood Realm. It could be said that Xiao Chun was the first person of the same generation to defeat Yin Sheng. This had always bothered Yin Sheng. In addition, given the relationship between the Heavenly Yin Tower and the Sword Sect, it was impossible for Yin Sheng to pretend that he did not know that Xiao Chun had actually entered the territory of the Myriad Weapon Residence and appeared in Jinluan City. A cold light flashed in Yin Sheng's eyes. No one knew what he was thinking. Was he planning to directly attack Xiao Chun? Was he going to kill Xiao Chun in the territory of the Myriad Weapon Residence? However, it was obviously very difficult to do so, since Xiao Chun had rushed over. How could he not be prepared? Moreover, if it was really so easy to kill Xiao Chun, the Sword Sect would have been destroyed long ago. At the same time, as the sect leader of the Sword Sect, if Xiao Chun attacked Xiao Chun, it was almost equivalent to starting a war with the Sword Sect. It should be known that starting a war with the Sword Sect now was not good news. There was still the Heavenly Policy residents eyeing them covetously. Chapter 2244. Yin Sheng was obviously a little nervous about Xiao Chen's appearance in Jinluan City. After all, Xiao Chun was now the sect leader of the Sword Sect. His every move could change the situation in the Great Thousand World, so he had to be on guard. Yin Sheng was obviously a little nervous about Xiao Chen's appearance in Jinluan City. After all, Xiao Chun was now the sect leader of the Sword Sect. His every move could change the situation in the Great Thousand World, so he had to be on guard. However, Looking at Xiao Qin's actions, it seemed like he had no intention of attacking the Heavenly Yin Tower. Could it be that he came to Jinluan City for the ancient ruins? However, was a mere ancient ruin worth Xiao Qin's personal visit? Although it was confirmed that the ancient ruins were left behind by the Reincarnation Emperor. Although the Reincarnation Emperor was powerful, he was at most on par with Xiao Qin's master, Jun Wuya. As a disciple of Jun Wuyuan, Xiao Qun had inherited all of Jun Wuya's teachings. The inheritance of the Samsara Emperor was not that important to him. Yin Sheng felt strange, but after weighing the pros and cons, he decided to make a trip to Jinluan City personally. After all, Xiao Qun was now in Jinluan City, so Yin Sheng could not be careless. Yin Sheng left the Heavenly Yin Tower on the same day with Su Ming and the other experts and rushed to Jinluan City. However, just like Xiao Qun, Yin Sheng's trip was extremely secretive. He did not tell anyone, and even the city governor's mansion of Jinluan City did not know that Yin Sheng had come to Jinluan City. In Jinluan City, Xiao Qun and the others were waiting for the ancient ruins to open. However, after the incident with the shrines, Song Xing, Lin Qing, and the others felt that it was a little troublesome. The shrines must have known that Xiao Qun was in Jinluan City by now. Sect leader, do you think we need the shrines? Song Xing asked worriedly as they sat together and drank wine. In Song Xing's opinion, the shrines should have sent some spies to keep an eye on Shen Hui's every move. However, Xiao Qin merely smiled and said, "There's no need. Shen Hui won't come." Shen Hui must have already known that he was in Jinluan City. Xiao Qun was even certain that Shen Hui had already told Yin Sheng about this. However, Shen Hui would not personally come to Jinluan City. Based on the current relationship between the Sword Sect and the shrines, the Divine Splendor would not take the initiative to provoke the Sword Sect. Compared to the Divine Splendor, Yin Sheng and the Heavenly Yin Tower should be on their guard. After all, this was the Myriad Weapon Residence's territory, the Heavenly Yin Tower's territory. Once Yin Sheng found out about him, Xiao Qun wasn't sure what he would do. Would Yin Sheng take this opportunity to take a gamble and see if he could stay in the Myriad Weapon Residence forever? Or would he retreat in the face of difficulties and endure silently? If Yin Sheng wanted to attack him, Xiao Qun would naturally have no choice but to fight back. When that happened, the Sword Sect and the Heavenly Yin Tower would probably have to fight again. However, this was something that couldn't be helped. Xiao Qin had to come because this matter concerned Xinyuan Ling. Even if he had to fight with the Heavenly Yin Tower, Xiao Qin wouldn't hesitate. It still depended on Yin Sheng's own choice. However, in Xiao Qin's opinion, the possibility of Yin Sheng attacking him wasn't high. However, he still had to be on guard. Time passed day by day, and more people gathered in Jinluan City. However, this didn't affect Xiao Qin much. During these few days, Xiao Qun and his group lived in seclusion and rarely went out. Xiao Qin patiently waited for the ruins to open. In the Jinluan City's city lord's residence, Yin Sheng had already brought people to Jinluan City 3 days ago. However, he chose to keep the news of his arrival a secret. At this moment, in the pavilion in the backyard of the city lord's residence, Yin Sheng was drinking tea as he spoke to a Heavenly Yin Tower expert beside him. "How is it? Is there still no movement from Xiao Qin's side?" Replying to Sect Master, "There isn't. It seems like they are really waiting for the ruins to open." Hearing this, the Heavenly Yin Tower expert replied truthfully, "Came for the ruins?" Hearing this, Yin Sheng didn't believe it at all. He didn't believe that Xiao Qun would enter the Myriad Weapon Residence and personally come to Jinluan City for a mere ancient ruin. To ordinary warriors, the Reincarnation Emperor's ruins were indeed very attractive. However, to people like Xiao Qun, there was nothing to be concerned about. Therefore, Yin Sheng didn't believe that Xiao Qun came for the ruins. This was simply impossible. He must have other motives, and this was what Yin Sheng was concerned about. Go! Continue to monitor, but don't act rashly and alert the enemy. Hearing this, Yin Sheng waved his hand and said, after leaving with this expert, Yin Sheng's eyes revealed a look of contemplation. He couldn't help but ask, "Xiao Qun, what exactly are you doing in Jinluan City?" Yin Sheng couldn't figure out Xiao Qin's motive for personally coming to Jinluan City. The people outside obviously didn't expect that there were two sect masters of the 10 great Ling Tian sects in Jinluan City. If the people outside knew that Xiao Chun and Yin Sheng had personally come to Jinluan City would probably become the center of attention of the entire Great Thousand World. There was nothing special about it. Very few people knew about the existence of Xiao Chun and Yin Sheng. In this peaceful wait, another 5 days passed. Late at night, the ruins, which had been quiet for a long time, suddenly shot up into the sky with a golden light. This golden light naturally attracted the attention of many warriors. For a time, many people flew towards the entrance of the ruins outside the city. The relic is finally going to open. Many warriors thought excitedly. After waiting for so many days, the ruins finally opened. Everyone was naturally excited. Meanwhile, in Xiao Chen's residence, Cao Xing looked at the golden light that soared into the sky outside the city. He looked at Xiao Chun and said, "Sect Master, yes, let's go." Hearing this, Xiao Chen nodded calmly. After hearing Xiao Chen's words, the group immediately rushed towards the ruins outside the city. Although it was already late at night at the entrance of the ruins, more and more people were gathering. However, with so many people, they were divided into several camps. First, there were a few major forces who occupied the best positions. They were the Shrines, Moon Palace, Saber Sect, and Heavenly Sect. These major forces occupied the best positions, which were also the closest to the entrance. Regarding this, no one dared to have the slightest objection. The 10 Great Ling Tian sects were like 10 pillars in the Great Thousand World, supporting the entire Great Thousand World. In particular, after the division of the 10 prefectures, the 10 Great Ling Tian sects' control of the Great Thousand World had reached a peak. If any force wanted to survive, they had to rely on the 10 Great Ling Tian sects. Therefore, it was understandable that the 10 Great Ling Tian sects occupied the best positions. At the location where the shrines were, the 2 deputy shrines who were in charge of leading the team kept looking in the direction of Jinluan City. One of them asked worriedly, "Do you think that Xiao Chun will show up today?" The shrines knew that Xiao Chun had personally come to Jinluan City, so they were also guessing whether Xiao Chun would show up today. If Xiao Chun showed up, what should the shrines do? Should they hand over the ruins, take advantage of the chaos, or fight fiercely? Chapter 2245. They were somewhat nervous about Xiao Chen's arrival. After all, the Divine Splendor had not personally come to Jinluan City. As such, the 2 deputy palace masters of the shrines naturally felt a lot of pressure when facing Xiao Chun. Just as the 2 of them were secretly nervous, more than 10 figures descended from the sky at the place closest to the entrance of the ruins, directly occupying the position closest to the entrance. Someone actually dared to bypass the shrines and the lunar palace and stand directly at the entrance of the relic. Seeing this scene, everyone's expression froze, but no one dared to say anything. After all, the shrines and the lunar palace were standing in front of them. Since someone dared to bypass them and temporarily occupy the entrance, the shrines and the lunar palace would definitely not turn a blind eye to it. Everyone was waiting for the shrines and the lunar palace's reaction. Some people even felt that the sudden appearance of more than 10 people was simply courting death. Did they not see that even the shrines and the lunar palace did not dare to be so arrogant? Everyone was from the 10 Great Ling Tian sects, and no one was willing to submit to the other. Naturally, everyone took a step back. Everyone knew that the hunter would shoot the bird that sticks out. However, the sudden appearance of more than 10 people obviously did not know this. They were actually so arrogant the moment they arrived. However, amidst the shock, some people quickly recognized the newcomers. Someone exclaimed, "They are from the Sword Sect." The sudden appearance of more than 10 people was indeed Xiao Chen's group. As the sect leader of the Sword Sect, Xiao Chun was naturally able to suppress the shrines and the lunar palace. After all, people like the Divine Splendor and the Dao Ju had not personally come to Jinluan City. There was no doubt that Xiao Chen's status was the highest among those present. As such, there was naturally no problem for him to suppress the shrines and the other forces. As everyone's identities were recognized, Xiao Chen naturally became the focus of everyone's attention. At first, no one recognized Xiao Chen's identity. However, as the two deputy palace masters of the Lunar Palace took the initiative to step forward and bowed respectfully to Xiao Chen, they called out sect leader Xiao Chen. Upon hearing this, everyone finally recognized Xiao Chen's identity. It was no wonder he dared to be so arrogant. It turned out that the sect leader of the Sword Sect, Xiao Chen, had personally come. In this case, the Sword Sect indeed had a reason to be arrogant. No one present could compete with Xiao Chen and the Lunar Palace Masters of the Lunar Palace and the Lunar Palace Masters. Of course, Xiao Chen did not have to give anyone face. In the face of the two deputy palace masters of the Lunar Palace, Xiao Chen nodded slightly and said, "Yes, the Lunar Palace should not interfere in this matter of the ruins. It's meaningless. I will personally inform Fourth Senior Sister about the details." In Xiao Chen's opinion, the various treasures in the ruins had probably been plundered by Xian Yuanling. The most important thing, the Reincarnation Emperor's inheritance, must have been obtained by Xian Yuanling as well. Therefore, there was nothing valuable left in the ancient ruins in front of them. Due to the relationship between Xiao Xiao and Xiao Chen, the Lunar Palace and the Sword Sect were like allies. Therefore, Xiao Chen did not mince his words to the two deputy palace masters of the Lunar Palace. Upon hearing Xiao Chen's words, the two deputy palace masters were slightly taken aback, but they still nodded in agreement. Since Xiao Chen had personally spoken, the two deputy palace masters of the Lunar Palace naturally would not refuse. They immediately nodded in agreement. Although the Lunar Palace did not have any objections to Xiao Chen's words, one of the deputy sect masters of the Heavenly Sect snorted unhappily and said, "Oomph, who do you think you are? Do you think we will give up just because of a few words?" The Heavenly Sect should have been destroyed the last time. However, they were lucky enough to meet an idiot like Long Ye. With the help of the Dragon Palace, the Heavenly Sect was able to come back from the dead. However, upon hearing the deputy sect master's words, Lin Qing, who was standing beside Xiao Chen, turned his head and shouted angrily, "Do you want to die?" Xiao Chen was the sect master of the Sword Sect. How could he allow others to humiliate him? Lin Qing was about to draw his sword when Xiao Chen waved his hand. He then looked at the deputy sect master of the Heavenly Sect and said indifferently, "You won't be so lucky every time." The Heavenly Sect managed to escape the previous time. However, I don't know if the Heavenly Sect will be so lucky next time. Xiao Chen's only purpose in coming to Jinluan City was to find Xian Yuanling. Therefore, he did not want to cause any trouble. Moreover, now was not the time to attack the Heavenly Sect. Currently, Xiao Chen was most wary of the Heavenly Yin Tower. After all, this was the Heavenly Yin Tower's territory. However, after hearing Xiao Chen's words, the deputy sect master of the Heavenly Sect turned pale. This was because everyone knew that the Heavenly Sect was almost destroyed by the Sword Sect. It was also because they lost to the Sword Sect that the Heavenly Sect was now at the bottom of the 10 Great Ling Tian sects. Almost everyone believed that the Heavenly Sect was the weakest and the Sword Sect was obviously stronger than the Heavenly Sect. This was because the Heavenly Sect was defeated by the Sword Sect. With a pale face, the deputy sect master of the Heavenly Sect did not say anything else. This was because he knew what he was capable of in front of Xiao Chen. Moreover, Yang Chen was not present this time. If they were to clash with the Sword Sect, the Heavenly Sect would definitely be at a disadvantage. At that time, if they were to be ruthlessly humiliated by the Sword Sect in front of so many people, the Heavenly Sect's face would be completely lost. Seeing that the deputy sect master of the Heavenly Sect did not say anything else, Xiao Chen could not be bothered with him. Lin Qing, on the other hand, glared at him fiercely before turning his head away. However, at this moment, a voice with obvious hostility sounded. Sect Master Xiao is still as overbearing as before. Along with the voice, Yinsheng also appeared with more than 10 Heavenly Yin Towers experts. Yinsheng's appearance caused everyone's expression to change slightly. Originally, they thought that it was just an ordinary relic that appeared. Who would have thought that it would actually attract two sect masters of the 10 Great Ling Tian sects? It should be known that with the foundation of the 10 Great Ling Tian sects, they would definitely not place too much importance on the Emperor's relic. What a joke. There were already living emperors in the sect. Who would be interested in a dead person? However, it was precisely because of this that the reincarnation Emperor's relic had attracted both Xiao Chun and Yin Sheng. As the saying goes, when enemies meet, their eyes blaze with hatred. The two of them, who already had a grudge against each other, met again. Yin Sheng was obviously filled with hostility, while Xiao Chun chuckled. What does it have to do with you whether I'm overbearing or not? Indeed, Xiao Chun did not have a good impression of Yin Sheng. Both of them had been like this since the first time they met in the wood boundary. Now that the Heavenly Policy Mansion was here, it was even more so for Xiao Chun. After all, between the Heavenly Policy Mansion and the Heavenly Yin Tower, Xiao Chun would definitely choose the Heavenly Policy Mansion and Li Chun. As such, it was destined that Xiao Chun and Yin Sheng could only stand on opposite sides. It was impossible for them to become friends. Chapter 2246. Facing Yin Sheng, Xiao Chun didn't give him any face. Since they were destined to be enemies, why should he feign civility? Facing Yin Sheng, Xiao Chun didn't give him any face. Since they were destined to be enemies, why should he feign civility? Hearing Xiao Chun's words, Yin Sheng also snorted coldly. He looked at Xiao Chun with eyes full of coldness and said coldly, "Let's see how long you can be arrogant." He didn't know why, but every time he faced Xiao Chun, Yin Sheng couldn't help but burn with anger. However, he couldn't do anything to Xiao Chun. Although Yin Sheng was now the sect master of the Tianyin Tower, Xiao Chun wasn't afraid of him at all. Moreover, it seemed that every time he fought with Xiao Chun, he was the one who suffered in the end. Without saying anything more, Yin Sheng didn't choose to take action. Because until now, he still didn't know the purpose of Xiao Chun's visit. He thought of many possibilities, but they were all rejected by Yin Sheng in the end. He really couldn't figure out why Xiao Chun would appear here. Before he figured out the purpose of Xiao Chun's visit, Yin Sheng didn't want to take action rashly. On the other side, Xiao Chun didn't have much of a change in expression when he saw Yin Sheng's arrival. However, he smiled bitterly in his heart. Although he had already guessed that Yin Sheng would definitely come personally. After all, it was related to him. Yin Sheng couldn't turn a blind eye to it. However, after seeing Yin Sheng in person, Xiao Chun still felt a little helpless. Because of Yin Sheng's presence, who knew what kind of trouble he would cause. However, no matter what, he had to deal with it accordingly. Anyway, Xiao Chun's purpose was to help Xinyuan Ling. As long as Xinyuan Ling was safe, Xiao Chun's purpose would be achieved. The appearance of Xiao Chun and Yin Sheng brought a great deal of pressure to everyone present. At this moment, everyone outside the ruins was extremely cautious, afraid that they would offend these two great gods. Even the people of Shrines, Moon Palace, and Saber Sect restrained themselves a lot at this time. There was no other way. Xiao Chun and Yin Sheng had come in person. They didn't dare to provoke them unless their sect masters were also present. But now, they naturally didn't dare to provoke Xiao Chun and Yin Sheng. Everyone was quietly waiting for the relic to open. Fortunately, it didn't take long before the seal around the relic slowly disappeared. A wisp of excitement flashed through everyone's eyes when they saw this. The ruins had finally been opened. However, because Xiao Chun and Yin Sheng didn't move, the surrounding people naturally didn't dare to act rashly. Although the ruins had been opened, there was a hierarchy in order to enter. Xiao Chun and Yin Sheng didn't move, so the others naturally didn't dare to move, including powerful forces like Shrines and Moon Palace. Xiao Chun didn't have any intention to enter the ruins because Xiao Chun wasn't interested in it at all. Seeing that Xiao Chun didn't understand, Yin Sheng didn't have the slightest intention to enter either. His eyes glanced at Xiao Chun from time to time. He knew very well that Yin Sheng's attention was all on him at this time. Yin Sheng wasn't interested in the ruins either. An ancient ruin was nothing in Yin Sheng's heart. Compared to Xiao Chun, it was simply negligible. Knowing that Yin Sheng was staring at him, Xiao Chun didn't say anything. Instead, He looked at the surrounding cultivators and said, "If you want to enter, then do it." So many people were waiting for him and Yin Sheng to move, but Xiao Chun didn't have any intention to enter the ruins from the beginning to the end. Therefore, he opened his mouth to let the others do as they pleased. These people were all here for the ruins. Letting them enter might save them a lot of trouble later. After all, the inheritance in the ruins must have been obtained by Xin Yuanling. If they were allowed to enter and search for it, when Xin Yuanling came out, Xiao Chun could take the opportunity to take Xin Yuanling away. Xiao Chun said in a seemingly generous manner. Hearing this, Yin Sheng frowned and thought to himself, sure enough, Xiao Chun didn't come here for this ancient ruin at all. Yin Sheng was already sure that Xiao Chun didn't come here for this ancient ruin. However, the others didn't think so much. Hearing Xiao Chen's words, someone finally couldn't help but stand up and cupped his hands toward Xiao Chun. Since Sect Master Xiao said so, my Heavenly Eye Sword Sect thanks Sect Master Xiao. After saying this, he directly led his people into the ruins. Xiao Chen didn't stop him at all. With someone taking the lead, the rest was naturally easy to handle. Not long after, the crowd entered the ruins one after another, ignoring Xiao Chun and Yin Sheng who were standing at the entrance. Naturally, the crowd didn't kill them. They could see that Xiao Chun and Yin Sheng didn't care about the ruins at all. Since that was the case, they naturally wouldn't let go of this opportunity. Group after group of people entered the ruins. Soon, there were only 4 groups left outside the entrance: Xiao Chun, Yin Sheng, the shrines of the ruins, and the Moon Palace. The Moon Palace obeyed Xiao Chun and gave up on the ruins. Therefore, they didn't enter. As for the shrines, they were similar to the Moon Palace. They had received orders from Shan Hui and had given up on the ruins long ago. Only the 4 groups were left. At this time, Xiao Chun still had a calm expression on his face. Very quickly, half a day passed. Yin Sheng and Xiao Chun stood at the entrance for half a day. After such a long time, Xiao Chun still didn't make the slightest move. This made Yin Sheng even more puzzled. What exactly was Xiao Chen's purpose? However, just as Yin Sheng was secretly puzzled, a figure slowly walked out from the entrance of the ruins. After seeing who it was, Yin Sheng finally understood. The person who had come was none other than Xiao Chen's elder brother, Xin Yuanling. Although Yin Sheng had never met Xin Yuanling, he had heard of him long ago. After all, the matter of Xiao Chun and his 2 siblings was no secret in the Great Thousand World. Moreover, Yin Sheng paid special attention to Xiao Chun. Naturally, he had a special understanding of Xiao Chen's deeds. Seeing Xin Yuanling appear here, Yin Sheng quickly figured everything out. There had long been rumors that Xiao Chen's elder brother, Xin Yuanling, cultivated the power of samsara. In this way, it wasn't strange for him to appear here. It must be because of the inheritance of the samsara emperor. Moreover, it seemed that he had already obtained the inheritance. Xiao Chun had personally come to Jinluan City to receive his elder brother. After understanding all this, Yin Sheng immediately looked at Xiao Chun with a cold smile and said, "Great sect leader Xiao is indeed scheming. His elder brother has already obtained the inheritance of this ruins. Great sect leader Xiao is still keeping it a secret. You have fooled us." As soon as Yin Sheng said this, Xiao Chen's eyes gradually turned cold. "Why? Are you trying to stop me?" How could Xiao Chun not understand the meaning of Yin Sheng's words? At the same time, Xin Yuanling also came to Xiao Chen's side. He first looked at Yin Sheng warily, then said somewhat worriedly, "Third brother. Big brother, don't worry. Everything will be fine." Xin Yuanling obviously knew that Yin Sheng had come with ill intentions. However, Xiao Chun gave him a reassuring look, indicating that he would handle it. Chapter 22:47. After indicating that Xin Yuanling was fine, Xiao Chun once again looked at Yin Sheng. Facing Xiao Chen's gaze, the smile on Yin Sheng's face became even colder. "I didn't say that. However, shouldn't Sect Master Xiao give everyone an explanation for doing this?" As soon as Yin Sheng said this, a cold glint flashed across Xiao Chen's eyes. This guy's words made him stand on the opposite side of everyone present. Thinking about it, there were so many people present. Almost all the people from the major forces were present. Now, the inheritance and treasures in the ruins were all obtained by Xinyuan Ling. One could imagine what everyone would think. The purpose of so many people gathering here was self-evident. It was for the ruins. But now, the ruins have been emptied by Xinyuan Ling. Wouldn't this make everyone's trip in vain? Yinsheng's heart gradually turned cold. He was obviously trying to provoke a conflict between the sword sect and everyone present, while he reaped the benefits. However, it was also at this time that some of the people who had entered the ruins began to return one after another. Everyone's face showed some displeasure, not for other reasons, because in the end, they did not find anything in the ruins. This was an empty ruin, so everyone was naturally disappointed. However, although they were disappointed, no one dared to vent their anger on Xiao Chun and Yinsheng. Therefore, when they saw that Xiao Chun and Yinsheng were still at the entrance of the ruins, many people forced a smile and said, "Sect Master Xiao, Sect Master Yin, this ruin is empty. It seems that we have made a trip in vain." After all, they were unwilling to get involved in the conflict between Yinsheng and Xiao Chun. As mortals, they were not qualified to participate in a fight between immortals. However, at this moment, Yinsheng said with a smile, "Everyone, don't be anxious. I know that this is an empty ruin. However, don't you want to know why this is an empty ruin?" As Yinsheng said this, he looked at Xiao Chun with a cold smile. Hearing Yinsheng's words, everyone who returned from the ruins had different expressions. However, they all stopped in their tracks. Everyone also wanted to know what was going on. Seeing that everyone was interested in this, the smile on Yinsheng's face became even brighter as he said unhurriedly, "Actually, we have to ask Sect Master Xiao of our sword sect, or rather, we have to ask Sect Master Zhao's sworn brother, Xinyuan Ling." As soon as Yinsheng said this, everyone's eyes involuntarily looked at Xiao Chun and Xinyuan Ling. At the same time, after a pause, Yinsheng continued, "Actually, Xinyuan Ling was already in the relic before it was opened. It's very normal for everyone to gain nothing after entering the relic because the inheritance and various treasures of the relic are currently with Xinyuan Ling." The moment these words were spoken, everyone looked at Xinyuan Ling with eyes that clearly carried a hint of hostility. Thinking about it, it was normal. Everyone gathered here from all over the Great Thousand World in order to find an opportunity in the ruins. However, in the end, it was all for naught. This was obviously unacceptable. Sensing the hostility in everyone's eyes, Yinsheng sneered in his heart. Now that Xiao Chun had angered everyone, if they were to fight, this motley crew might not be a match for the sword sect. However, Yinsheng would definitely be happy to see this. After all, no matter how strong the sword sect was, how could they offend all the sects in the Great Thousand World? If that was the case, it would be enough to make the sword sect suffer and even destroy the sword sect. Yinsheng's move was indeed a little sinister. However, just as he was secretly sneering, Xiao Chun suddenly spoke. "The inheritance and treasures of the ruins were indeed obtained by my elder brother." Xiao Chun said slowly without any change in his expression. He did not deny what he had said. After all, it was impossible to hide such a thing even if he wanted to, so he might as well admit it openly. Seeing that Xiao Chun had taken the initiative to admit it, everyone present was stunned. However, before they could recover from their shock, Xiao Chun continued. "However, my elder brother has obtained the inheritance of the Reincarnation Emperor. It's not an exaggeration to say that he's the successor of the Reincarnation Emperor. Moreover, my elder brother was the first to discover the ruins. Before the ruins were discovered, my elder brother had already found the location of the ruins. Therefore, even if it's based on who came first, the ruins should belong to my elder brother," Xiao Chun said plainly. Hearing this, everyone present had different expressions. Some felt that Xiao Chun's words made sense, while others felt that they were not convinced. After memorizing everyone's expressions, Xiao Chun continued. "However, since everyone has come a long way and obtained nothing, and in addition, everything in the ruins was indeed obtained by my elder brother, my sword sect will naturally not be unreasonable. As the sect master of the sword sect, I, Xiao Chun, can once again promise everyone that my sword sect will definitely compensate everyone. Xiao Chun was willing to compensate everyone present. Hearing this, many people's expressions eased up slightly. Although they knew that the sword sect's compensation might not be comparable to the treasures in the ruins, they had still obtained something. It was actually enough. Moreover, Xiao Chun had already done everything he could. With the sword sect's current strength and influence, what could they do even if there was no compensation? Could it be that they really dared to become enemies with the sword sect? Sure enough, after saying these words, Xiao Chen's eyes quickly revealed a trace of coldness. At the same time, a terrifying aura surged from his body. His domineering gaze swept across everyone present as he spoke in a deep voice. However, if anyone believes the nonsense of others and harbors resentment towards my sword sect, or even wants to cause trouble, then I can accompany you to the end. That's all I have to say. Everyone, make your own choice. Those who are willing to believe in me can leave now. In a few days, the sword sect will naturally send compensation to you. If you want to become enemies with the sword sect, feel free to stay. However, you will have to bear the consequences. First, he offered everyone compensation for their deaths, and then he made an undisguised threat. Following Xiao Chen's words, everyone present was silent for a few breaths. Many of them secretly looked at each other, and soon someone made a choice. Sect Master Xiao, please forgive us. We naturally don't dare to become enemies with the sword sect. We'll leave now. After the first person left, a second person quickly followed. Since Xiao Chun had already given them enough face and even didn't hesitate to compensate them, they naturally wouldn't fail to appreciate his kindness. If they really angered Xiao Chun, then it wouldn't be too difficult for the sword sect to annihilate them. Begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2248. Xiao Chun knew the consequences of angering the crowd. With so many people present, it was impossible for him to not give them an explanation. Therefore, Xiao Chun could only give some compensation. He was very clear that no matter how strong a force was, it was far from being able to go against the entire world. Unless the Sword's Gate had already dominated the Great Thousand World, then it would still be fine. However, that was not the case. The current Sword's Gate was only one of the top 10 Ling Tian sects, and was far from being able to dominate the Great Thousand World. Xiao Chun gave everyone present enough, and the many cultivators present were obviously not stupid. They immediately nodded and left one after another. Seeing that Xiao Chun had resolved all of this with just a few words, the cold light in Yin Sheng's eyes became even more vigorous. Originally, Yin Sheng had intended to provoke a conflict between the sword sect and the various forces present. This way, Yin Sheng would have an opportunity to kill Xiao Chun here. However, it seemed that such an opportunity did not exist now. The people of the various forces were stunned by Xiao Chun with just a few words. Although Yin Sheng also knew that Xiao Chun would have to pay a huge price for the compensation he promised, it was impossible for him to attack Xiao Chun today. Of course, Yin Sheng could also choose to fight Xiao Chun by force. However, if he did that, the chances of him killing Xiao Chun would be very small. He would only be able to vent the anger in his heart. After becoming the sect master of the Heavenly Yin Tower, Yin Sheng was no longer as naive as he was in the Wood Boundary. He knew that he had to deal with everything calmly and weigh the pros and cons. Now, it was obviously meaningless to attack Xiao Chun by force. After taking a deep breath, Yin Sheng quickly put on a smile and looked at Xiao Chun. Great sect master Xiao, you're indeed a good person. Same here, Xiao Chun replied plainly. Xiao Chun had no intention of fighting Yin Sheng at this time, because it was also meaningless. The two of them looked at each other, and their gazes collided in the air. Then, Xiao Chun spoke first. Let's go. Xiao Chun prepared to leave. Yin Sheng did not stop him. He watched Xiao Chun leave with a cold gaze. After Xiao Chun disappeared, Yin Sheng left with his people with a cold expression. The appearance of the ancient ruins, which should have been an intense competition, ended just like that. Many cultivators could be said to have made a wasted trip. However, It was not that they did not gain anything. After all, the sword sect would give them a certain amount of compensation. They did not continue to stay in the 10,000 weapon mansion. After all, this was the territory of the heavenly Yin Tower. Although Yin Sheng did not attack, who knew if he had any other schemes? Along the way, they did not encounter any ambushes from the heavenly Yin Tower. Xiao Chun heaved a sigh of relief as the group entered the sword mansion safely. After safely entering the sword mansion, Xiao Chun and the rest slowed down. At the same time, Xiao Chun and Xin Yuanling talked about what had happened in the past few years. Xin Yuanling did not have much to say. After leaving the sword sect, Xin Yuanling came directly to the ancient ruins to receive the inheritance of the reincarnation emperor. It could be said that he had received the inheritance of the reincarnation emperor. Xin Yuanling's cultivation had broken through to the great perfection of the Tao realm. He only needed one more step to break through to the end realm. Xiao Chun was naturally happy to see such an improvement. This also showed how powerful the inheritance of the reincarnation emperor was. No wonder even Jun Wuya was full of praise when he talked about the reincarnation emperor. It seemed like the reincarnation emperor was not simple. Xin Yuanling did not have much to say. However, what Xiao Chun told Xin Yuanling shocked him. Firstly, the sword sect defeated the heavenly sect and was now one of the 10 great Lingtian sects. Secondly, it was the destruction of the Dragon Palace. So many big things had happened in the Great Thousand World. After hearing Xiao Chen's description, Xin Yuanling was so shocked that he was speechless for a long time. Fortunately, nothing happened to Long Qing. This was the most gratifying thing. They returned to the sword sect safely. Long Qing was also very happy to see Xin Yuanling. However, at this moment, there were two pairs of big eyes looking at Xin Yuanling curiously. These two were Xiao Chen's sons, Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao. These two brats had just turned 6 years old. It was the time for them to be mischievous. The two brats were also filled with curiosity towards Xin Yuanling, whom they had never seen before. This was because they could tell that this person had an unusual relationship with their father and mother. Xiao Chen naturally saw Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao. He waved at them and said, "This is your uncle. Hurry up and greet him." Xin Yuanling and Xiao Chen were sworn brothers. Naturally, he was Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao's uncle. Hearing this, the two boys called out timidly, "Uncle." Xiao Chen was very strict with the two boys. He was different from Qin Shu and the other girls. Therefore, when facing Xiao Chen, Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao seemed to be a little afraid of their father. However, it was strange. Although they were afraid, these two boys liked to stick to Xiao Chen. Hearing this, Xin Yuanling smiled and nodded. He sighed in his heart. After a period of seclusion, Xiao Chen already had two fat boys. Xin Yuanling liked the two boys very much. Xiao Chen also said that he hoped that Xin Yuanling would accept Xiao Yao as his disciple. Xiao Lao had already become Long Qing's disciple. Xiao Yao naturally wanted to become Xin Yuanling's disciple. In this regard, Xin Yuanling naturally would not refuse. He simply nodded and agreed. Immediately, under Xiao Chen's request, Xiao Yao bowed 3 times and kowtowed 9 times. She also served tea and became Xin Yuanling's disciple. In the courtyard, Xin Yuanling sat on a stone bench. In front of him, Xiao Yao raised a teacup and served tea to Xin Yuanling. After taking a sip of tea, Xin Yuanling officially accepted Xiao Yao as his disciple. Xiao Yao also addressed Xin Yuanling as master. Xin Yuanling's safe return and Xiao Yao becoming his disciple made Xiao Chen's mood very good. That night, everyone gathered together to drink and chat. The 3 siblings had not gathered together to drink for a long time. For the 3 of them, this was the happiest moment of their lives. However, at this moment, a sword elder came and said that he wanted to see Xiao Chen. Xiao Chen did not know what it was about, but he still nodded and agreed. Soon, the sword elder came before Xiao Chen. He first bowed respectfully to Xiao Chen, then said with an ugly expression, "Sect Master, young miss killed someone." The young miss mentioned by the sword elder was undoubtedly Xiao Wan. Xiao Wan was now an inner disciple of the sword sect. Hearing that Xiao Wan had killed someone, Xiao Chun frowned slightly. Even Qin Shiru and the other girls came forward and asked with complicated expressions, "What happened?" Chapter 2249. Qin Shiru and the other ladies revealed worried expressions when they heard that Xiao Wan had killed someone. The sword elder answered truthfully, "It's someone from the family Nangong." Qin Shiru and the other ladies revealed worried expressions. "It's someone from the family Nangong." According to the sword elder, Xiao Wan got into an argument with an inner disciple of the family Nangong for some unknown reason. Then, Xiao Wan unsheathed her sword and killed the family Nangong disciple. The matter was not complicated. However, killing someone in the sect, especially a fellow disciple, was obviously against the rules of the Sword's Gate. After hearing the elder's explanation, Qin Shu and the other girls immediately wanted to go and see what was going on. However, Xiao Chun said indifferently, "What are you going to do? Let the law enforcement hall handle it." Qin Shu and the other ladies revealed displeased expressions when they heard Xiao Chen's words. Wouldn't Xiao Wan have to suffer if the law enforcement hall handled the matter? After all, it was a fact that Xiao Wan had killed a fellow disciple in public. "How can you do this?" "No, I have to go take a look." Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu, who had a fiery temper, didn't care about Xiao Chen's obstruction and left immediately. The two ladies were worried about Xiao Wan. They were afraid that Xiao Wan would be taken advantage of. However, as the headmaster of Swords Gate, Xiao Chun had to consider the entire Swords Gate. Even if Xiao Wan was his daughter, he could not openly violate the rules of the Swords Gate. However, the matter hadn't been clarified and they didn't know why Xiao Wan had killed someone. Therefore, it wasn't easy to come to a conclusion. Xiao Chun let out a helpless sigh and said to the sword elder, "Let the law enforcement hall handle it. Let me know after they find out the reason." Xiao Chun believed that Xiao Wan would not kill someone for no reason. There must be a reason behind this. Hearing this, the elder nodded respectfully. The law enforcement hall was in charge of the sword sect's laws and regulations, and Nangong Guan happened to be the vice sect master in charge of the law enforcement hall. At this time, several elders of the law enforcement hall had already gathered in Nangong Guan's residence. Looking at Nangong Guan, who was sitting on the main seat, these elders all had grave expressions on their faces. This time, Xiao Wan's incident was not a small matter. Moreover, it happened to involve the family Nangong. Moreover, Xiao Wan was Xiao Chen's daughter. If something went wrong, Xiao Chen might be unhappy. With a heavy expression, Nangong Guan sat on the main seat without saying a word, but soon, the sword elder who had met with Xiao Chen returned. Seeing this, Nangong Guan asked, "What did sect master say?" Reporting to vice sect leader's intention is to investigate the cause of the matter before making a decision. Hearing this, the sword head elder replied truthfully. Xiao Chun did not have any intention of siding with Xiao Wan. Of course, this was on the premise that Xiao Wan was in the wrong. Hearing this, Nangong Guan nodded slightly and said, "Go to the law enforcement hall and summon Xiao Wan and everyone related to this matter." Within the law enforcement hall, Nangong Guan and the other elders of the law enforcement hall quickly gathered. Xiao Wan and everyone related to this incident were all brought to the law enforcement hall. However, just as everyone was preparing to interrogate Xiao Wan, Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu barged in. Gu Lingyao said with a displeased expression, "Senior brother Nangong, it shouldn't be a problem for the two of us to listen in, right?" The two women were obviously afraid that Xiao Wan would be taken advantage of, so they specially came. Seeing the two women arrive, Nangong Guan revealed a bitter smile and nodded. Of course, Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu were both Xiao Chen's women, so Nangong Guan naturally would not offend them for no reason. Moreover, just listening in wasn't a big deal. An elder personally brought over 2 chairs for the two women. After the two women sat down, Xiao Wan and 2 inner core disciples were brought over. Seeing Xiao Wan, Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu nodded slightly, indicating that she did not need to be afraid. As for the young man beside Xiao Wan, when he saw Nangong Guan, he immediately cried out, "Uncle, you have to uphold justice for my family Nangong." The young man's name was Nangong Xiu Lin. and he was a direct descendant of the family Nangong. He could be considered Nangongwan's nephew, and he was very talented. He was the leader of Nangongwan's younger generation. Nangongwan didn't expect that this matter would involve Nangong Xiaolin. She frowned and shouted in a deep voice, "Nonsense! There is no uncle here. I am the vice sect master of the sword sect, the hall master of the law enforcement hall." Nangong Xiaolin immediately called her uncle, which made Nangongwan feel a bit gloomy. Didn't he see that Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu were still sitting there? Was he trying to compete with Xiao Luan in terms of background by claiming to be relatives? What an idiot. After being reprimanded by Nangongwan, Nangong Xiaolin immediately changed his way of addressing her. Nangongwan then began to ask about the matter. According to him, Xiao Wan had killed people indiscriminately. Because of a small matter, Xiao Wan had drawn her sword and killed people. Furthermore, according to Nangong Xiaolin, Xiao Wan had become a little tyrant in the inner court. Relying on her status and background, Xiao Wan had committed all sorts of outrages in the inner court. She had bullied the weak and violated the sex rules. Hearing Nangong Xiaolin's story, Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiaolin couldn't help but frown slightly. With their understanding of Xiao Wan, it was obvious that Xiao Wan wouldn't do such a thing. However, after Nangong Xiaolin finished speaking, the other inner court disciple beside her also nodded and confirmed that what Nangong Xiaolin said was true. Facing Nangong Xiaolin and Hong Xiaolin's accusations, Xiao Wan didn't interrupt. Her expression was incomparably calm. Apart from nodding when she saw Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiaolin at the beginning, Xiao Wan had closed her eyes and rested. It was as if everything before her had nothing to do with her. When Nangong Xiaolin finished speaking, Nangongwan finally looked at Xiao Wan. Seeing Xiao Wan's calm expression, Nangongwan was secretly curious, but she still asked, "Xiao Wan, do you have anything to say?" Hearing Nangongwan's question, Xiao Wan slowly opened her eyes and said in a neither servile nor overbearing manner, "Yes." As she spoke, Xiao Wan cast a disdainful glance at Nangong Xiaolin. Seeing that, a trace of anger flashed through Nangong Xiaolin's eyes. However, Xiao Wan ignored it and turned her head to look at Nangongwan. Everything that Nangong Xiaolin said just now, I can only say that you're twisting the truth and are shameless. In Nangong Xiaolin's words, Xiao Wan was a person who relied on her status and background to do whatever she wanted in the inner court. Of course, Xiao Wan wouldn't admit to that. Hearing Xiao Wan's words, Nangong Xiaolin immediately shouted coldly, "Xiao Wan, I think you're the one twisting the truth. Did I say anything wrong about what you did in the inner court?" "Heh, Nangong Xiaolin, you know the truth better than I do. There's no need to put on an act here." Hearing that, Xiao Wan coldly smiled and looked at Nangong Xiaolin with disdain. Please add, please vote, please recommend. The error-free chapters of Sword Master 8 Desolation will continue to be updated in the hand-fighting bar. There will be no advertisements on the website. Please add and recommend the hand-fighting bar. If you like Sword Master 8 Desolation, please add Sword Master 8 Desolation. Chapter 2250. While Xiao Wan and Nangong Xiaolin were arguing in the law enforcement hall, Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu personally went to the law enforcement hall out of worry. However, Xiao Chun had been extremely calm the entire time. One could even say that he did not care. Tianyu walked up to Xiao Chun angrily and asked through gritted teeth, "Are you really not going to care about Wan Wan?" From Tianyu's point of view, Xiao Wan was Xiao Chen's daughter. Furthermore, Tianyu knew Xiao Wan's character well. She would not kill someone for no reason, let alone someone from the same sect. Growing up in the sword sect, Xiao Wan's feelings for the sword sect were unimaginable. Tianyu did not understand what Xiao Chun was thinking. Hearing this, Xiao Chun gently pulled Tianyu over and sat her down beside him. He smiled and said gently, "Don't worry. Wan Wan is my daughter. Of course, I know what she is, and I believe in her. Then why aren't you showing up?" Tianyu asked in confusion. "Haha, after all, the child has grown up. There are some things that she needs to learn to face on her own. This incident may be a good experience for Wan Wan. It will let her know that in this world, Other than strength, there are many things that are indispensable. With that, Xiao Chun retracted his gaze and said to himself, "You can't be too naive about some things. All right, I won't interfere in this matter. You guys can do as you see fit." Tian Yu did not understand what Xiao Chun meant. However, Flower Fairy smiled and said, "I'll go to the law enforcement hall." With that, the fairy of 100 flowers floated away. Looking at the departing figure of the fairy of 100 flowers, the corners of Xiao Chen's mouth unconsciously curled into a smile. At the same time, he thought to himself, still too inexperienced. From Xiao Chen's point of view, although Xiao Wan had gone through a series of trials, she was still too inexperienced. While Xiao Chun was sighing, Xiao Wan recounted everything that had happened in the law enforcement hall. In Xiao Wan's words, Nangong Xiaolin became the person who abused her status and background to bully the weak. As for why she killed someone today, it was because Nangong Xiaolin's cousin, who is also a direct descendant of the family Nangong, had forcefully humiliated an inner court female disciple. This made Xiao Wan was furious and decided to kill Nangong Xiaolin. Hearing that Nangong Min had done something worse than a beast, Hong Xiao and Gu Ling Yao's faces darkened. They felt that Xiao did the right thing. Xiao Wan deserved to be killed. However, in the face of Xiao Wan's words, Nangong Xiaolin smiled faintly and said, "Ridiculous. What a joke. Xiao Wan, even if you're the daughter of the sect master, you can't confuse right and wrong like this. Xiaolin, SSS, Xiaolins. Nangong Xiaolin, you know whether I'm speaking the truth or not. Are you still going to deny it?" Xiao Wan didn't expect that Nangong Xiaolin would still deny it. However, Nangong Xiaolin didn't care about Xiao Wan's anger. She even smiled coldly at Xiao Wan. It was as though she was saying, "You're too inexperienced to fight with me." Nangong Xiaolin turned to Nangong Guan and said with grief and indignation, "Vice Sect Master, Xiao Wan is slandering and framing me. I hope Vice Sect Master can uphold justice for me." Nangong Xiaolin actually took the initiative to complain. Xiao Wan couldn't help but scold her. "Nangong Xiaolin, don't you have any shame?" Xiao Wan didn't expect Nangong Xiaolin to be so thick-skinned and still refused to admit it. However, Nangong Guan said calmly, "Xiao Wan, since you said that Nangong Xiaolin and Nangong Min bullied others in the inner court, and that you killed Nangong Min because he raped a female disciple, do you have any evidence?" Since Xiao Chan said that he would let the law enforcement hall handle this matter, Nangong Guan would naturally be impartial. She wouldn't side with Nangong Xiaolin or Xiao Wan. If that was the case, Xiao Wan would need to show evidence. Hearing Nangong Guan's words, Xiao Wan said coldly, "Vice Sect Master, you can bring that female inner court disciple here. Then you'll know whether I'm speaking the truth or not." Xiao Wan had personally witnessed Nangong Min humiliating that female disciple. That was why she was so angry that she killed Nangong Min. In Xiao Wan's opinion, as long as she brought that female disciple here, the truth would be revealed. Nangong Xiaolin sneered when she heard Xiao Wan's words. She didn't seem worried at all. Nangong Guan said in a deep voice, "Fine, bring that female disciple here." Soon, the female disciple that Xiao Wan said was humiliated by Nangong Min was brought to the law enforcement hall. She was quite pretty. Although she wasn't an outstanding beauty, she was still pretty. Nangong Guan looked at the female disciple and asked, "Xiao Wan, you said that you were humiliated by Nangong Min. I'm asking you now, is that true?" Xiao Wan was very confident in Nangong Guan's question. She believed that the truth was about to be revealed. However, what Xiao Wan didn't expect was that after hearing Nangong Guan's question, the female disciple actually shook her head. "Vice Sect Master, Nangong Min didn't humiliate a disciple." Xiao Wan's expression changed when she heard those words. She looked at the female disciple in disbelief. Today, she clearly saw Nangong Min humiliating that female disciple with her own eyes. It could even be said that Xiao Wan killed Nangong Min because the female disciple asked for help. But now, in front of Nangong Guan, the female disciple actually denied that Nangong Min had humiliated her. Xiao Wan looked at the female disciple in disbelief. She was speechless for a long time. However, at this time, Nangong Xiaolin loudly said, "Vice Sect Master, please uphold justice for this disciple." Nangong Xiaolin was obviously making false accusations. However, Nangong Guan ignored him and looked at the female disciple with a dignified expression. "Do you know where this place is?" "I know," the female disciple replied with a nod. "Then do you know the consequences of lying here?" "I know," the female disciple replied again. "Good. Very good. Since you know, then I'll ask you again. Did Nangong Min humiliate you today?" Nangong Guan asked again. Faced with Nangong Guan's question again, the female disciple's face became even paler. However, after a long silence, she gritted her teeth and shook her head. "Vice Sect Master, Nangong Min didn't humiliate me." "He didn't?" Hearing those words, Xiao Wan felt like the world was spinning. She didn't understand why this female disciple would lie. She was clearly humiliated by Nangong Min. Chapter 22:51. Xiao Wan didn't understand why this female disciple would say such a thing. She was clearly raped by Nangong Min, and Xiao Wan had only killed Nangong Min to save her. Xiao Wan didn't understand why this female disciple would say such a thing. She was clearly raped by Nangong Min, and Xiao Wan had only killed Nangong Min to save her. But now, in front of Nangong Guan, Gu Lingyao, Hong Xiu, and the others, this female disciple actually flatly denied it all. Xiao Wan still remembered how terrified this female disciple was when she first met her. But now it had turned out like this. Xiao Wan didn't expect things to turn out like this. Nangong Xiaolin smiled and said loudly, "The truth is clear." Xiao Wan relied on her status to wantonly kill her fellow disciples. "Vice Sect Master, please uphold justice for us." Nangong Xiaolin took the opportunity to shout. Hearing this, Xiao Wan's face turned red. She looked at Nangong Xiaolin angrily and said, "Nonsense. The truth is clearly not like this." Xiao Wan was indeed too inexperienced. She didn't expect this female disciple to flatly deny everything. Now, without any evidence, Xiao Wan had killed her fellow disciples for no reason. Nangong Xiaolin sneered inwardly at the infuriated yet helpless Xiao Wan. Such an inexperienced girl actually wanted to fight with her? Justice in this world wasn't as simple as it seemed on the surface. This female disciple had indeed been raped by Nangong Min, and the truth was as Xiao Wan had said. But so what? Nangong Xiaolin had 100 ways to make this female disciple not dare to tell the truth. She didn't dare to tell the whole story. Xiao Wan knew too little about the dark side of the world and the darkness of people's hearts. She never would have thought that the female disciple she had saved would make such a false accusation. It had to be said that Nangong Xiaolin's move had stunned Xiao Wan. Nangong Xiaolin sneered at Xiao Wan and said unhurriedly, "Junior Sister Xiao, what do you mean by this?" "Junior Sister Xiao, what do you mean by that? Could it be that you still want to twist the truth and confuse the truth with the witness and material evidence?" Nangong Xiao had a righteous expression on his face. It was as if he was the righteous party. Facing that, Xiao Wan was furious. However, she simply didn't know how to refute him. That was because she didn't know how to handle the current situation. Looking at the helpless Xiao Wan, Gu Lingyao and Hong Xiu also frowned. The two of them unconsciously looked at the female disciple kneeling on the ground. The female disciple's face was pale. Clearly, she was extremely terrified. The two ladies had followed Xiao Chun all the way from the Eight Desolates world to the Great Thousand World. They had experienced much more than Xiao Wan, so they could naturally tell that something was fishy. He was certain that this female disciple did not dare to speak the truth for some reason. The truth seemed to have been made clear, and now everyone was waiting for Nangong Guan to make the final decision and decide who would bear the responsibility for this matter. From the current situation, the one who was in the wrong was undoubtedly Xiao Wan. That was because she couldn't produce any evidence at all. On the other hand, Nangong Xiaolin had both witness and material evidence. Seeing that Xiao Wan was forced into a corner, A woman in a white dress slowly walked in from outside the courtyard. She had a gentle and moving temperament. She was Xiao Wan's second mother, Hundred Flower Fairy. Hundred Flower Fairy's appearance shocked everyone present. Even Nan Gong Wan, who was sitting on a main seat, stood up and called out, "Second, madam." Facing Nan Gong Wan's greeting, Hundred Flower Fairy revealed a faint smile and bowed, "Senior brother Nan Gong." Compared to when she faced Gu Ling Yao and Hong Xiu, Nan Gong Wan was clearly more serious. From Nan Gong Wan's point of view, although Hundred Flower Fairy and the other two all had the same temperament as Xiao Chun, Gu Ling Yao and Hong Xiu were far inferior to Hundred Flower Fairy in certain aspects. As Xiao Chen's second wife, Nan Gong Wan was very clear on how terrifying Hundred Flower Fairy was. She was a woman with monstrous wisdom and was very intelligent. She was far superior to Hong Xiu and Gu Ling Yao. Hundred Flower Fairy's arrival made Nan Gong Wan feel that there might be a change in the situation. Gu Ling Yao and Hong Xiu also stood up and walked in front of Hundred Flower Fairy, their expressions somewhat unfriendly. "Elder sister, the situation is a bit difficult to handle." Gu Ling Yao and Hong Xiu Lin were present the entire time. It could be said that the current situation was extremely unfavorable for Xiao Wan. However, Hundred Flower Fairy still smiled and said, "Don't worry, I'm here." After saying this, Hundred Flower Fairy turned to look at the aggrieved Xiao Wan, then glanced at the somewhat dazed Nangong Xiulin, and finally fixed her gaze on the female disciple. Hundred Flower Fairy didn't care about a junior like Nangong Xiulin at all. However, when facing Hundred Flower Fairy, Nangong Xiulin didn't know why, but she couldn't help but feel nervous. In Nangong Xiulin's eyes, Hundred Flower Fairy was an extremely beautiful woman. Although Gu Ling Yao and Hong Xiu were also very beautiful, in terms of temperament, Hundred Flower Fairy was completely different from them. However, it was Hundred Flower Fairy's temperament that caused Nangong Xiulin to be shocked. Of course, Nangong Xiulin wasn't a fool. She knew that Hundred Flower Fairy wasn't a woman she could covet, so she only gave her an infatuated glance before hurriedly retracting her gaze. Hundred Flower Fairy didn't care about the change in Nangong Xiulin's expression at all. She turned to Nangong Guan and said indifferently, "Senior brother Nangong, may I ask a few questions?" "Of course." "Second, madam, please," Nangong Guan replied straightforwardly. With Nangong Guan's permission, Hundred Flower Fairy walked in front of the female disciple. Although she was also a woman, when facing Hundred Flower Fairy, the female disciple was dazed. She sighed in her heart. There was actually such a perfect woman in this world. Compared to Hundred Flower Fairy, even she felt inferior. Hundred Flower Fairy didn't release any aura, but did she try to pressure the female disciple? Hundred Flower Fairy walked in front of the female disciple and said indifferently, "East Sword City's Zhou clan's young miss, Zhou Yuan. Your father is called Zhou Qiang, right?" Hearing Hundred Flower Fairy's words, Zhou Yuan's expression changed. Nangong Xiulin's expression also became serious. She immediately revealed Zhou Yuan's identity. In response, Zhou Yuan silently nodded. Seeing this, Hundred Flower Fairy indifferently glanced at Nangong Xiulin and said, "Your father seemed to have lost his way. However, he just so happened to be met by my people. Now, he has safely returned home." Hundred Flower Fairy's words made Xiao Wan at a loss. He didn't understand what she meant at all. However, hearing this, Zhou Yuan and Nangong Xiulin's expressions greatly changed, especially Nangong Xiulin. Her face instantly became gloomy, and cold sweat continuously appeared on her forehead, begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2252. Hundred Flower Fairy's seemingly simple words immediately made Nangong Xiulin nervous. While Zhou Yuan looked at Hundred Flower Fairy with an expression of disbelief, her eyes filled with shock and confusion. In truth, Hundred Flower Fairy had easily found out why Zhou Yuan was hiding the truth. It was because Nangong Xiulin had ordered people to kidnap Zhou Yuan's parents. With her parents in Nangong Shilin's hands, Zhou Yuan could only do as Nangong Shilin requested. That was why she hid the truth and refused to admit that Nangong Min had raped her. 100 Flower Fairy easily dispelled Nangong Shiolin's little tricks. With 100 Flower Fairy's means, rescuing Zhou Yuan's parents from Nangong Shiolin's clutches wasn't a difficult task at all. 100 Flower Fairy smiled faintly and looked outside the door. Soon, 2 Sword Sect elders led 4 inner sect deacons and Zhou Yuan's parents in. Seeing that her parents were safe and sound, Zhou Yuan cried tears of joy. Nangong Shiolin, on the other hand, felt a chill run down her spine. Her legs went soft, and she fell to the ground. These 4 inner sect deacons were more or less related to the family Nangong and were extremely respectful to Nangong Shiolin. Today, the 4 of them had followed Nangong Shiolin's orders to take Zhou Yuan's parents away. But at this moment, 100 Flower Fairy easily dispelled all of Nangong Shiolin's tricks. Looking at Zhou Yuan again, 100 Flower Fairy said indifferently, "Now you can be at ease and speak the truth." Hearing 100 Flower Fairy's words, Zhou Yuan took a deep breath, then looked at Nangong Wan and spoke in a deep voice. Vice Sect Leader, this disciple can testify that senior sister Xiao Wan indeed killed Nangong Min to save me. Today, Nangong Min, since her parents were safe and sound, Zhou Yuan no longer had any misgivings and spoke the truth. Today, when Nangong Min was doing something improper to her, Xiao Wan happened to see it. With Xiao Wan's personality, she naturally couldn't sit idly by and watch, so she got into an argument with Nangong Min. As the young master of the Nangong family, Nangong Min was used to being arrogant. Even when facing Xiao Wan, he wasn't afraid at all. Both sides refused to back down. In the end, Xiao Wan killed Nangong Min in a fit of anger. The truth was already very clear, and it was exactly as Xiao Wan had said. As Zhou Yuan revealed the truth, Nangong Shilin's face was already as pale as a sheet of paper. He knew that he was finished. With Nangong Wan's personality, even if he was a direct descendant of the family Nangong, it would still be difficult for him to escape punishment. He might even be crippled of his cultivation and kicked out of the Sword Sect. In the end, Nangong Shilin was harmed by Nangong Min. Nangong Min was stupid and fell into Xiao Wan's trap. Who was Xiao Wan? If it was Nangong Shilin, he definitely wouldn't go against Xiao Wan. However, Nangong Min didn't know the immensity of heaven and earth and was courting death. In the end, although Nangong Shilin didn't want to be enemies with Xiao Wan, because Xiao Wan killed Nangong Min, Nangong Shilin had no other choice but to think of a way to protect himself. Originally, Nangong Shilin wanted to hide the truth and take the righteous side. Then, he would be merciful and let Xiao Wan off this time. This would resolve the conflict between them. Nangong Shilin never thought of doing anything to Xiao Wan. He only wanted to protect himself. But now, it seemed that all of this was impossible. His little tricks were completely broken by Hua Fairy. Hearing Zhou Yuan's story, Nangong Wan's face was as gloomy as iron. In the past few years, Nangong Wan had been busy with other matters in the Sword Sect and rarely paid attention to the family Nangong. However, he clearly didn't expect that because of him, a family Nangong disciple would do such a thing in the Sword Sect. He looked coldly at Nangong Shilin. Facing Nangong Wan's gaze, Nangong Shilin's expression became ugly. However, he still lowered his head and kneeled on the ground. He said in a deep voice, "This disciple knows his mistake." Now you know your mistake? But what's the use? Men, cripple Nangong Shiolin's cultivation and chase him out of the Sword Manor. Nangong Wan was extremely disappointed in Nangong Shiolin and shouted without hesitation. Nangong Shiolin panicked when he heard Nangong Wan's words. He looked regretful as he begged for mercy. "Uncle, I really know my mistake. I won't do it again." Nangong Shiolin naturally couldn't accept his cultivation being crippled. Once his cultivation was crippled, his life would be over, let alone being chased out of the Sword Sect. After hearing Nangong Shiolin's begging, Xiao Wan hesitated for a while before saying, "Vice Sect Master, although Nangong Shilin is at fault, this isn't the end of it. I hope Vice Sec Master can be lenient. Xiaowan wasn't familiar with Nangong Xiulin, but as far as she knew, Nangong Xiulin wasn't the same type of person as Nangong Min. At the very least, Nangong Xiulin didn't do anything worse than a beast like Nangong Min. Moreover, Nangong Min had already been killed, and Nangong Xiulin was implicated by Nangong Min crippling his cultivation and chasing him out of the sword sect was a heavy punishment. Hearing this, Nangong Xiulin looked at Xiao Wan gratefully. Hearing this, Nangong Xiulin looked at Xiao Wan gratefully. Hearing this, Nangong Guan remained silent for a while, then looked at Baihua Fairy and the other two women and asked, "Madams, what do you think?" To be honest, Nangong Guan didn't have the heart to cripple Nangong Xiulin's cultivation. However, this matter was related to Xiao Wan, and the three ladies were present. Nangong Guan had to give an explanation. Facing Nangong Guan's question, 100 Flower Fairy smiled and said, "Senior brother Nangong is too serious. The three of us can't interfere in the matters of the law enforcement hall, so we'll let senior brother Nangong make the decision. However, this punishment is a bit too heavy. After all, the main culprit is Nangong Min, not Nangong Xiulin. Senior brother Nangong, please be magnanimous and give him a chance." 100 Flower Fairy didn't have the intention to kill Nangong Xiulin. In her opinion, a junior like Nangong Xiulin wasn't worth the trouble. Moreover, Nangong Xiulin was a good seedling, and he wasn't an unpardonably evil person. If he was given a chance, it would be best if he could turn over a new leaf. Xiao Wan and 100 Flower Fairy both pleaded for Nangong Xiulin. After a moment of silence, Nangong Guan looked at Nangong Xiulin and shouted angrily, "You bastard! Bastard, you better remember that if it weren't for Xiao Wan and Second Madam pleading for you today, I would have crippled you and sent you to the Cliff of Reflection for a year. If you dare to offend me again in the future, I will not let you off easily." Hearing Nangong Guan's punishment, Nangong Xiulin nodded and said, "Disciple knows his wrongs. I won't dare to offend you again. Please add me to your collection. Please recommend me." Chapter 2253. Nangong Xiulin was punished by the Cliff of Reflection for a year. This punishment wasn't too severe. Of course, if it weren't for Xiao Wan and 100 Flower Fairies pleading, Nangong Guan wouldn't have made such a decision. Nangong Xiulin was punished by the Cliff of Reflection for a year. This punishment wasn't too severe. Of course, if it weren't for Xiao Wan and 100 Flower Fairies pleading, Nangong Guan wouldn't have made such a decision. Now that the truth was out, the matter had come to an end. Xiao Wan followed beside 100 Flower Fairy, but there wasn't the slightest trace of joy on her face. She knew that if it weren't for 100 Flower Fairy, she wouldn't have been able to explain herself. 100 Flower Fairy didn't mind and smiled. "You still have a lot to learn. You'll slowly learn in the future." She didn't mean to blame Xiao Wan. Xiao Wan might have been a little impulsive, but who hadn't been young before? 100 Flower Fairy and the others had also been at Xiao Wan's age. Hearing 100 Flower Fairy's words, Xiao Wan silently nodded. The group left the law enforcement hall. As soon as they stepped out, they saw Qin Xian anxiously waiting for them. Qin Xian had been waiting outside the law enforcement hall. Regarding Xiao Wan's matter, there was nothing he could do. Although Qin Xian was the young master of the Qin clan, he didn't have the qualifications to interfere with the law enforcement hall's matters. Thus, Qin Xian had no choice but to wait outside. Now that Xiao Wan had returned safely, Qin Xian finally let out a sigh of relief. He quickly walked over, but in front of 100 Flower Fairy and the other two girls, Qin Xian couldn't help but feel nervous. Seeing the nervous Qin Xian, 100 Flower Fairy smiled. "You guys can chat. Wan, if you have time, come back. Your father has something to say to you." 100 Flower Fairy and the other two girls didn't pay much attention to Qin Xian. As soon as they finished speaking, the three girls floated away. Xiao Wan was also accompanied by Qin Xian, walking towards the inner sect. Xiao Wan's matter was resolved perfectly. That night, Nangong Guan even went to look for Xiao Chun and took the initiative to admit her mistakes. As the vice sect master in charge of the law enforcement hall, Nangongwan blamed herself for what her family Nangong had done in the sword sect. However, Xiaoqin didn't blame Nangongwan. After all, as the sword sect grew, such things were inevitable. However, because of this matter, Xiaoqin still hoped that Nangongwan's law enforcement hall would be stricter so that the sword sect's rules could be implemented. Nothing could be accomplished without rules. Even if Xiaoqin's children violated the sect rules, they would not be exempted from punishment, let alone others. Nangongwan naturally didn't hesitate to agree to Xiaoqin's request. The two of them chatted for around 2 hours before Nangongwan said goodbye and left. Xiao Wan's matter didn't cause too much of an impact in the sword sect. This was also something that Xiaoqin intended. In the next few days, Longqing and Xianyuanling went into seclusion to try to break through to the End Realm. Xiaoqin also prepared many pills and cultivation resources for the two of them to support their breakthroughs. Longqing and Xianyuanling could be considered monstrous geniuses. If the two of them broke through to the End Realm, they would be of great help to the sword sect. Xiaoqin naturally didn't hold back in helping the two of them. After Xianyuanling and Xianyuanling went into seclusion, Xiaoqin didn't slack off on his cultivation. However, on this day, the Daoju of the sword sect personally sent a letter to Xiaoqin, saying that they wanted to hold another sword and saber conference. Xiaoqin had heard of this sword and saber conference before. It could be considered a tradition between the sword sect and the sword sect. In the past, before the sword sovereign Patian fell, the sword sect and the sword sect would hold a sword and saber conference every once in a while, allowing the elite disciples of the sect to fight. Sword and saber cultivators were old enemies since ancient times. The sword sect and the sword sect, one was a holy land for saber cultivators, while the other was a holy land for sword cultivators. Naturally, they were filled with competition. Therefore, the sword and saber conference could be considered a grand event in the great wide world. However, with the decline of the sword sect, the sword and saber conference had not been held for many years. To put it bluntly, the sword sect was no longer qualified to be mentioned in the same breath as the sword sect. However, with the rise of the sword sect and the rise of the sword sect, the restless Daoju once again thought of the sword and saber conference. Xiaoqin didn't reject Daoju's invitation, but he also didn't accept it. He told Nangongwan, Songxing, and the other deputy sect leaders about this matter. When they heard that Daoju proposed to hold another sword and saber conference, they all spoke up. Sect leader, the sword and saber conference is a tradition between the sword sect and the saber sect. If it's held again, it can be considered a grand event. Yes, that's right. However, the sword and saber conference is for the elite disciples of both sides to fight. It's said that the 10 great saber disciples of the saber sect are all extremely talented people. If they fight, I'm afraid our disciples will be at a disadvantage. Lin Qing, what are you talking about? Are the core disciples of the sword sect weaker than the 10 great saber disciples of the saber sect? In addition to the outer disciples, inner disciples, and core disciples of the saber sect, there are also the 10 great saber disciples. The 10 great saber disciples were the most talented, the most powerful, and the most profound among the hundreds of thousands of disciples in the saber sect. They were given the title of saber disciple. At any given time, the number of saber disciples in the saber sect would only be 10. It would not be more or less. This was the tradition of the saber sect. When Lin Qing mentioned the saber disciples, there was clearly a trace of admiration on his face. This was because no matter what, the 10 great saber disciples of the saber sect were a special feature of the saber sect. Moreover, they had indeed brought honor to the saber sect. This was why Lin Qing felt that if the saber sword conference was held, then the core disciples of the sword sect probably wouldn't be a match for the 10 great saber disciples. Lin Qing's words are correct. According to what I know, the 10 great saber disciples this time have all reached the End Realm. Their strength is close to the elders of the saber sect. They can't be underestimated. End realm cultivation was indeed not bad. Moreover, to be able to become a saber disciple, their combat strength obviously wouldn't be weak. This point was even more unquestionable. Everyone spoke out. Hearing this, Xiao Chun, who was sitting on the main seat, smiled slightly. 10 great saber disciples. That's interesting. However, today we're discussing whether or not to agree to this saber sword conference. Everyone, please directly state your position. Whether or not to agree to the saber sword conference. Hearing Xiao Chen's words, everyone fell into hesitation. First of all, this saber sword conference was definitely a matter of face. Looking at the current situation, if the core disciples of the sword sect wanted to defeat the 10 great saber disciples of the saber sect, their chances were not high. If they lost too badly, wouldn't the sword sect lose face? They were afraid of failure. However, seeing this, Xiao Chun smiled and said, "Actually, in my opinion, failure is nothing. As a martial artist, as a disciple of the sword sect, if you don't have the courage to move forward, then what is the point of talking about other things? Although the 10 great saber disciples of the saber sect are strong, the disciples of the sword sect are not necessarily weak. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations." Chapter 2254. Lin Xing and the others felt that the disciples of the sword sect were still a little weaker than the disciples of the 10 great saber disciples. Once they fought, the sword sect would lose face. Lin Xing and the others felt that the disciples of the sword sect were still a little weaker than the disciples of the 10 great saber disciples. Once they fought, the sword sect would lose face. After all, the sword and saber conference would definitely attract a lot of attention. If the disciples of the sword sect lost too badly, then the sword sect would naturally lose face. But Xiao Chun had a completely different attitude towards this. Afraid of losing? In Xiao Chen's opinion, was there anything in this world that was guaranteed to win? If one chose to run away just because they were afraid of losing, then what kind of martial arts were they practicing? What kind of sword arts were they practicing? Xiao Chen's words made Song Xing's expression change. At the same time, they also understood Xiao Chen's thoughts. In fact, Xiao Chun had already decided in his heart that he would agree to Dao Ju's suggestion to hold another sword and saber conference. However, even if he had the determination and courage to move forward, in terms of strength, there was still a gap between the disciples of the sword sect and the disciples of the 10 great saber disciples. Moreover, this sword and saber conference was just a battle between the top disciples of both sides. The sword sect would definitely send out the disciples of the 10 great saber disciples. Seeing the worries in everyone's hearts, Xiao Chun smiled and said, "Let's go. Follow me to a place." Then, without waiting for Song Xing and the others to reply, Xiao Chun took the lead and flew into the air. Seeing this, although Song Xing and the others did not know where Xiao Chun was going, after exchanging glances, they still hurriedly chased after him. Behind the main peak of the sword sect, there was a deep valley. This valley was currently extremely desolate. Under normal circumstances, no one would come here. Seeing Xiao Chun enter the valley, Song Xing and the others were puzzled. As the vice sect master of the sword sect, they naturally knew what kind of place this valley was. Burial Sword Valley. This was the sword sect's Burial Sword Valley. All the swords abandoned by the disciples, deacons, and elders of the sword sect were discarded here. Over time, this place became a graveyard for swords. They didn't know why Xiao Chun had suddenly come to Burial Sword Valley, but since Xiao Chun didn't say anything, Song Xing and the others naturally didn't dare to ask. They could only follow closely behind Xiao Chun and enter Burial Sword Valley. As soon as he entered the valley, a wave of sword chi that carried an extremely sorrowful feeling assaulted his face. As far as the eye could see, broken swords could be seen everywhere in the valley. Some were broken, and some were covered by the traitorous disciples. The sword chi came from these broken swords. They could be said to be abandoned swords that had no use at all. Feeling the sorrowful sword chi in the valley, Song Xing and the others' moods seemed to be affected. However, they were all end-realm cultivators after all, and their mental fortitude was extraordinary. They quickly tossed aside these distracting thoughts. They walked all the way to the depths of Burial Sword Valley. The deeper they went, the thicker the sword chi. Of course, This sword chi didn't affect Xiao Chun and the others at all. They walked all the way to the depths of Burial Sword Valley. This place wasn't like the outside world where there were countless broken swords. There were only 10 swords that were stabbed deeply into the ground. Looking from afar, although these 10 swords were covered by the traitorous disciples and didn't have the sharpness of the past, one could still see that they weren't ordinary. Song Xing was the most experienced vice sect master of the sword sect. When he saw these 10 swords, he was first stunned. Then he couldn't help but exclaim in excitement, This is the 10 famous swords. There were 10 great saber disciples in the saber sect, and each of the 10 great saber disciples had a famous saber. Only the 10 great saber disciples could use this famous saber. Once they lost their status as a saber disciple, they would have to return this saber. Similarly, the sword sect also had 10 great sword maniacs. Just like the saber sect's disciples, the 10 great sword sect's disciples also had famous swords. They were the 10 long swords in front of them. The origins of these 10 long swords were something that even Song Xing didn't know. However, without a doubt, these 10 swords, no matter which one it was, were definitely the best of the best. Sword Sovereign Patian had spent a lot of effort and paid a huge price to find them. In the past, all the disciples of the sword sect were proud of these 10 swords. These 10 swords were one of the symbols of the 10 great sword sect's disciples. However, as the sword sect's power declined, the 10 great sword maniacs ceased to exist. These 10 swords also disappeared with the 10 great sword maniacs and were buried deep in the Sword Burial Valley. It was said that these 10 famous swords had given birth to sword spirits. Swords had spirits, so when the last batch of sword freak disciples were young, they would choose to sleep in the Sword Burial Valley and hide their sharpness, waiting for a new batch of sword freak disciples to appear and regain their recognition. Many years had passed, and these 10 swords were buried in the Sword Burial Valley. Even Song Xing had forgotten about their existence. And now, Xiao Chun led the group to this place. As though they were aware of Xiao Chen's identity, the 10 swords trembled subconsciously and let out deep sword hums. Upon hearing the sword hums, Song Xing and the others' expressions changed slightly. It wasn't difficult for them to hear the desolation and despair in the hums. Back then, the 10 great sword maniacs of the sword sect wielded the 10 great swords and were extremely awe-inspiring in this world. But now, these 10 great swords could only be buried deep in the Sword Burial Valley and could no longer be controlled by their masters. Many years had passed, and they had been waiting for their masters in the Sword Burial Valley. But year after year, the 10 great sword maniacs of the sword sect still hadn't appeared. But amidst the desolation and despair, there was an additional sense of anticipation, as though the 10 great swords knew that it wasn't long before they were reborn. After being buried for so many years, perhaps they would meet the 10 great sword maniacs who were strong enough to control them. Sword Maniac, sect master means. Song Xing returned to his senses and guessed Xiao Chen's intentions. He looked at Xiao Chun and asked in agitation. Facing Song Xing's question, Xiao Chun stood with his hand behind his back and gazed at the 10 great swords that were humming incessantly. That's right. I want to reselect the 10 great sword maniacs to participate in this sword blade conference and let the 10 great swords reappear in this world. Xiao Chun went up to the 10 swords and stroked one of them gently. The razor-sharp blade couldn't hurt Xiao Chun at all. Before Xiao Chun, the 10 great swords were as docile and obedient as children. The razor-sharp blade aura instantly turned gentle. Famed swords have spirits. How can they be buried deep in this dark burial sword valley? As one of the 10 famed swords of Swords Gate, it should be reborn and protect the glory of Swords Gate for eternity. Xiao Chun gently stroked the sword and softly murmured with a faint smile on his face. Chapter 2255. Xiao Chun gently stroked the blade of the sword with one hand and said with a faint smile on his face. As Xiao Chen's voice faded, 10 rays of sword aura suddenly shot up from the 10 swords into the sky. Xiao Chun gently stroked the blade of the sword with one hand and said with a faint smile on his face. As Xiao Chen's voice faded, 10 rays of sword aura suddenly shot up from the 10 swords into the sky. Xiao Chun did not want the famed swords to be covered in dust, so he wanted to establish the 10 disciples of the sword fanatics once again. For a moment, the 10 famed swords seemed to want to burst out all the grievances they had suffered over the years. Terrifying sword aura shot up into the sky from the burial sword valley. Even the many disciples in the sword gate could feel the 10 terrifying sword auras. That's the direction of the burial sword valley. Many disciples shifted their gaze to the burial sword valley as they couldn't understand why there was such terrifying sword aura. The 10 rays of sword aura shocked many disciples in the sword sect. As soon as Xiao Chun sensed the sword aura, the smile on his face widened. Don't worry, I won't let you be buried in the dark burial sword valley. Xiao Chen's group didn't stay in the burial sword valley for long before they left and returned to their residence. Xiao Chun instructed Song Xing to pass down the order for the sword sect to establish a new generation of the 10 sword fanatics whose status was above that of the core disciples. The 10 sword fanatics. This was considered a tradition in the sword sect. Xiao Chun replied to Dao Ju and agreed to hold the sword blade conference. However, he did set the date to be 2 years later. Dao Ju didn't reject Xiao Chen's suggestion, so be it 2 years later. Dao Ju didn't mind at all. The matter of the sword and saber conference was settled. At the same time, the news of the sword gate forming the 10 sword fanatics disciples quickly spread throughout the entire sword gate. Many disciples were extremely excited. However, some of the new disciples clearly did not know what a sword fanatic's disciple was. However, after the explanation of the older disciples, they quickly understood. To put it bluntly, the top 10 sword maniac disciples were the face of the sword sect. They were the representatives of hundreds of thousands of disciples in the sword sect and represented the strongest fighting strength of all the disciples in the sword sect. As for the status and power of the top 10 saber disciples of the saber sect, it was clear. It could be said that the sword maniac's disciples were the best among all the disciples. They were deeply admired and loved by many disciples of the sword sect. After understanding the lofty status and absolute power of the sword maniac's disciple, many disciples were completely boiling. The sword maniac's disciple was an existence that was second only to one person and above tens of thousands of people. Moreover, because he was going to rebuild the sword maniac's disciples, Xiao Chun was very generous with the conditions this time. No matter what level of disciple they were, as long as they were willing, they could sign up for the sword maniac's disciple selection. Of course, even though there were no restrictions in this regard, if one did not have true strength, then one would only be asking for a rebuff. Therefore, even though outer disciples could sign up for the sword maniac's disciple selection, everyone was clearly aware that the ones who could truly compete for the position of sword maniac's disciple were the core disciples. They were originally the strongest group of disciples in the sword sect. They enjoyed the best cultivation environment and resources. Their cultivation, combat strength, and natural talent were all the best among the numerous disciples in the sword sect. Only they were the strongest competitors for the sword maniac's disciple selection this time. Naturally, the core disciples were very clear about this. Therefore, they were even more excited than the inner and outer disciples, because this was an opportunity for them to leap over the dragon gate and ascend to the heavens in a single bound. In a beautiful abode in the core disciple area, this was the residence of the third core disciple of the sword sect, Lu Qingyao. Lu Qingyao's name resounded like thunder among the numerous disciples in the sword sect. It was not only because of her identity as the third core disciple, but also because of her peerlessly beautiful appearance. Some had even evaluated her as the number one beauty in the sword sect. Of course, this number one beauty didn't include Qin Shiru and the others. After all, no one dared to talk about Xiao Chen's wife behind her back. However, Lu Qingyao had always been very indifferent to all the praise in the outside world. Her temperament was indeed like that. She was quiet and elegant. She always gave others the feeling that she was as calm as water, as if nothing could arouse her interest. Except for one thing, and that was Xiao Chun. According to Lu Qingyao, Xiao Chun was the only person she admired, and her life's goal was to surpass Xiao Chun. For this reason, she didn't hesitate to enter the sword sect and cultivate tirelessly. In recent years, Lu Qingyao rarely made a move because there were already very few people in the sword sect who were worthy of her. Usually, Lu Qingyao rarely showed her face outside of cultivation. She lived in seclusion and gave others an extremely mysterious feeling. But at this time, beside a lotus pond in the cave, a young girl in green clothes was sitting in a pavilion by the lake, and in front of her was a handsome young man. The young man looked at Lu Qingyao with a hint of love in his eyes from time to time, but Lu Qingyao turned a blind eye to it, causing the young man to feel rather helpless. The young man was called Qin Kunlun, and he was also a well-known figure in the sword sect. He was the #1 core disciple, or rather, the #1 disciple in the sword sect. Among the numerous disciples in the sword sect, Qin Kunlun's strength was undoubtedly #1. The two of them sat opposite each other. Qin Kunlun knew that Lu Qingyao wasn't interested in him, or it could be said that Lu Qingyao was only interested in one man, and that was their sect master, Xiao Chun. Qin Kunlun knew this very well. Qin Kunlun took a sip of tea with a faint smile on his face. The sect master wants to reorganize the 10 sword freaks. Junior sister, you should be participating, right? Of course. Lu Qingyao nodded indifferently. Her attitude was very indifferent. Qin Kunlun had been pursuing Lu Qingyao for a very long time, but he had never been able to enter her eyes. According to Qin Kunlun's character, if other men dared to fight over a woman with him, then he definitely wouldn't let it go. However, the man in Lu Qingyao's heart was Xiao Chun, and this made Qin Kunlun extremely helpless. He knew that although he was very outstanding, at least enough to suppress the hundreds of thousands of disciples in the sword sect, Qin Kunlun had to admit that he paled in comparison to Xiao Chun. It could even be said that the two of them weren't on the same level at all. Qin Kunlun felt helpless in his heart, but he also knew that it was impossible for Xiao Chun to have anything with Lu Qingyao. Because after Lu Qingyao entered the sword sect, she had only seen Xiao Chun once, and at that time, Qin Kunlun and the other core disciples were also present. To Qin Kunlun, Xiao Chun was so unattainable, but it was the same for Lu Qingyao as well. Qin Kunlun hesitated again and again as he looked at the beautiful Lu Qingyao before him. In the end, he said, "Junior sister, the sect master and we aren't from the same world after all. Why do you have to do this?" Chapter 2256. Qin Kunlun wanted to persuade Lu Qingyao to let go, but after hearing his words, Lu Qingyao directly got up and said faintly, "I'm a little tired." Then she walked away. Looking at Lu Qingyao's back, Qin Kunlun opened his mouth, but in the end, it turned into a bitter smile. Others didn't know Lu Qingyao's thoughts, but Qin Kunlun understood. However, looking at Lu Qingyao's appearance, she probably wouldn't listen to him, no matter how much he said. Lu Qingyao went all the way to her room. It was just Lu Qingyao's boudoir, and on the wall of the room, there was a portrait of Xiao Chun. White clothes and white hair, giving people an ethereal feeling. To be honest, after joining the sword sect for so long, the number of times Lu Qingyao saw Xiao Chun could be counted on one hand. And this portrait was drawn by Lu Qingyao according to her memory. That's right. This portrait was drawn by Lu Qingyao according to her memory. Looking at the portrait, Lu Qingyao was a little lost in thought. "I just want to be closer to you." Others might be excited about the selection of the Sword Maniac's disciple, but for Lu Qingyao, the reason she wanted to become the Sword Maniac's disciple was not for anything else, but to be closer to Xiao Chun. In Lu Qingyao's opinion, perhaps after becoming the Sword Maniac's disciple, she should be able to have more contact with Xiao Chun. She should be able to be closer to Xiao Chun. Looking at the portrait in a daze for a long time, but in the end, it turned into a sigh. Then, she sat cross-legged on the futon and closed her eyes to cultivate. Xiao Chun might know Lu Qingyao's name, but he was definitely not familiar with it. Because in these years, Xiao Chun rarely paid attention to the internal affairs of the sword sect. He heard of Lu Qingyao's name only because she was the third core disciple, which could be regarded as the strongest batch of disciples in the sword sect. The selection of the sword maniac's disciple was handed over to Song Xing. The time was set to be 10 days later. At that time, all disciples who signed up could participate. To Xiao Chen's surprise, Xiao Wan also signed up for the selection of the sword maniac's disciple. 10 days passed very quickly, and it could even be said to be in the blink of an eye. On this day, the entire sword sect could be said to be in an uproar. Countless disciples gathered at the entrance of the Sword Burial Valley. Burial Sword Valley was the location of the selection of the sword maniac's disciples. Of course, this was also Chen's idea. There were a total of tens of thousands of disciples who signed up for the selection. Although it seemed like a lot, it was actually considered a small number. After all, there were hundreds of thousands of disciples in Swords Gate, and it could be assumed that many of them were aware of their prowess, which was why they chose not to come and humiliate themselves. So, the rules of the two stages were very simple, especially the first stage. They only needed to walk from the entrance to the deepest part of the Sword Burial Valley. Those who could reach the deepest part would pass, and those who couldn't would be eliminated. It didn't seem difficult, but things weren't that simple. As the selection began, more than 10,000 disciples rushed into the Sword Burial Valley. However, as soon as they entered the valley, many disciples felt a powerful sword aura coming at them. The sword aura was so dense that it was enough to injure them. If they didn't use their spiritual energy to defend themselves, they would be seriously injured or even lose their lives. The sword aura was condensed from countless broken swords in the Sword Burial Valley. It made it difficult for many disciples to move. As soon as they entered the valley, many disciples felt a great pressure. Some disciples who weren't strong enough were sent flying by the sword aura as soon as they stepped into the valley. They were seriously injured and fainted. The elders of the sword sect immediately ordered people to treat these seriously injured disciples. Of course, being seriously injured by the sword aura meant that they lost the qualifications to compete for the position of the sword fanatic's disciple. Outer sect disciples definitely had no chance. Not to mention passing through the Sword Burial Valley, it was extremely difficult for them to even walk a meter. Only the best among the inner core disciples could barely move forward under the pressure of the dense sword chi in the Burial Sword Valley. Of course, this was only temporary. The deeper they went into the Sword Burial Valley, the denser and sharper the sword aura was, and the greater the pressure. Originally, there were more than 10,000 people, but after a few hundred meters, there were less than 1,000 people left. In just a few hundred meters, most of the people had been eliminated. However, none of the core disciples had been eliminated. After all, the core disciples could be said to be the strongest group of disciples in the sword sect. There were hundreds of thousands of disciples in the sword sect, but there were only a little more than 100 core disciples. It was easy to imagine how difficult it was to become a core disciple. Not only cultivation realm, but also talent and combat strength were indispensable. Many of the core disciples were able to handle the sword aura with ease. Apart from them, the rest of the inner sect disciples were unable to move forward. Of course, there were some exceptions, and that was Xiao Wan. She was also an inner sect disciple, but facing the dense sword aura of the Sword Burial Valley, Xiao Wan did not show any signs of difficulty. Xiao Wan's relaxed performance naturally attracted the attention of many core disciples. Even Qin Kunlun and Lu Qingyao could not help but glance at Xiao Wan. Xiao Wan's identity was no longer a secret among the disciples. She was the daughter of the sect leader, Xiao Chun. Such an identity was enough to make Xiao Wan shine. They originally thought that Xiao Wan was just an inner sect disciple, but now it seemed that Xiao Wan's strength was not to be underestimated. She had already reached the comprehension realm. It had been a few years since Xiao Wan had entered the inner sect. It was not surprising that Xiao Wan had broken through to the enlightenment realm. As the world spirit of the Eight Desolates world, Xiao Wan's talent was definitely top-notch. As they walked deeper into the valley, more and more disciples were eliminated. In the end, even the core disciples could not withstand the sword aura of the Sword Burial Valley and were eliminated one after another. Even the core disciples could not withstand the dense sword aura of the Sword Burial Valley. Seeing the core disciples being led out of the valley by the elders, the disciples at the entrance of the valley were amazed. Even the core disciples could not pass the first round. The selection of the Sword Fanatic's disciple is really strict. Of course, after all, the Sword Fanatic's disciple represents hundreds of thousands of disciples in the Sword Sect. If it was so easy to become one, wouldn't it be a disgrace to the Sword Sect? Many disciples began to discuss in low voices. Chapter 22:57. At first, many disciples were shocked that the core disciples couldn't pass the first stage of the selection. Many of them even felt that the difficulty of the selection was too high. At first, many disciples were shocked that the core disciples couldn't pass the first stage of the selection. Many of them even felt that the difficulty of the selection was too high. After all, the core disciples were the strongest batch of disciples in the Sword Sect. It was indeed unexpected that they couldn't pass the first stage of the selection. But soon, someone retorted. This time, the selection was for the top 10 Sword Maniac disciples. Whether it was strength or talent, they must be above the core disciples. Moreover, they must be at least one level higher than the core disciples. Otherwise, how could they be qualified to become one of the top 10 Sword Maniac disciples? Many disciples gathered outside the valley and discussed softly. Their strength wasn't enough to compete for the top 10 Sword Maniac disciples, but didn't dampen their enthusiasm for the selection. While the disciples outside were debating, Qin Kunlun, Lu Qingyao, Xiao Wan, and the rest were still advancing in the valley. At this point, there were fewer and fewer people who could resist the sword chi. There were only a few hundred people left, and Xiao Wan was the only inner disciple left. Originally, Qin Xian and Xiao Wan had signed up for the Sword Maniac's disciple selection this time. However, Qin Xian had already been eliminated earlier. It couldn't be helped. Although Qin Xian was talented as the young master of the Qin clan, there was still a gap between him and Xiao Wan and the other core disciples. What's more, even the weaker core disciples couldn't withstand the sword chi here, let alone Qin Xian. One disciple after another was eliminated. In the end, everyone successfully reached the deepest part of the Burial Sword Valley. When the 10 swords were in front of them, there were only 30 people left. Tens of thousands of disciples signed up for the selection, but only 30 people passed in the end. Such a harsh test was indeed a little cruel. However, this was the result that Xiao Chun wanted to see. After all, this was the selection of the top 10 Sword Maniac disciples, not some rotten cabbage on the street. Xiao Chun had always insisted on the principle of better quality than substandard. If no one could pass the first stage of the selection, Xiao Chun would rather leave the position of the top 10 Sword Maniac disciples empty for the time being. However, the results weren't bad. At least 30 people made it to this point, including Xiao Wan. Apart from Xiao Wan, these 30 people were the cream of the crop among the core disciples. The fact that they could make it to this point proved their strength. As the disciples arrived at the deepest part of the Sword Burial Valley and gazed at the 10 famed swords, Qin Kunlun, the number 1 core disciple, couldn't help but reveal a glint of excitement in his eyes. 10 Suns Swords. Qin Kunlun had spent the past few days learning about the 10 sword fanatics of Swords Gate, so he naturally knew the origin of the 10 Sun Sword. The 10 Children's Sword was the collective name of the 10 famed swords in front of him. They belonged to each of the 10 great sword fanatics, and each of the 10 Children's Sword was a peerless divine weapon. Along with Qin Kunlun's shock, a clear laughter sounded out of nowhere. That's right, it's the 10 Children's Sword. Xiao Chun, Song Xing, Lin Qing, Nangong Wan, and the other higher-ups of the sword sect appeared one after another. Xiao Qin swept his gaze across the 30 people and said with a satisfied expression, "Not bad. It seems like all of you live up to your reputation. But whether you can become one of the top 10 sword maniac disciples in the end will depend on whether you have the strength to do so." Facing Xiao Chun and the other higher-ups of the sword sect, even Qin Kunlun couldn't help but feel a little nervous. Under his lead, everyone bowed respectfully. Greetings, sect leader and vice sect leaders. It was rare for the core disciples to see Xiao Chun. At this moment, Lu Qingyao, who stood beside Qin Kunlun, had her beautiful eyes fixed on Xiao Chun. Her eyes glinted with joy. Lu Qingyao was very happy to see Xiao Chun every time. Even if it was just a glance from afar, she felt that it was enough. Xiao Chun didn't feel Lu Qingyao's gaze. Or rather, he didn't care at all. The smile on his face didn't fade as Xiao Chun said indifferently, "I won't say much about what the top 10 sword maniac disciples mean to the sword sect. I believe all of you already know. Since you've passed the first stage, let's begin the second stage." The first stage was to eliminate those who weren't strong enough. The fact that Qin Kunlun and the others could reach this stage already proved that their strength was top-notch among all the disciples of the sword sect. Since that was the case, the second stage of the test was to show their true strength. Under the personal supervision of Tsang Xing, each of the 30 people present would have to fight with the other 29 people. In the end, the rankings would be determined based on the results. Only those who enter the top 10 would have the chance to become one of the top 10 sword maniac disciples. That's right, even if you successfully enter the top 10, it didn't mean that you would definitely become one of the top 10 sword maniac disciples. This was because there was still one final test, which was the test from the 10 child swords. One had to obtain the approval of one of the 10 child swords in order to become one of the top 10 sword maniac disciples. This was also the rule of a sword sect. Everyone knew that the 10 child swords had spirits. Whether or not the 10 child swords approved you was the key to whether you could become one of the top 10 sword maniac disciples. Of course, the premise was that you still had to pass the second stage of the test. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the chance to come into contact with the 10 child swords. Xiao Qin naturally attached great importance to the selection of the top 10 sword maniac disciples, so he planned to personally watch the battles. Sitting cross-legged in the air, Tsang Xing, Nan Gongguan, and the others gathered around Xiao Chun and smiled at Tsang Xing. "Let's begin." Hearing Xiao Chen's words, Tsang Xing immediately shouted, "The first battle, Qin Kunlun against Zhang Mingfeng." As soon as Tsang Xing's words came out, everyone below was stunned. Was it going to be an earth-shattering battle right from the start? Qin Kunlun was the number 1 core disciple, so there was no need to talk about his strength. Zhang Mingfeng wasn't weak either. He was ranked 7th core disciple, so he also belonged to the small group of people at the top. Tsang Xing arranged such a battle right from the start, which made everyone secretly excited. After all, they were all core disciples, but they hadn't fought for a long time, let alone in such an environment. Everyone spontaneously retreated to the side, leaving space for Qin Kunlun and Zhang Mingfeng. Xiao Chun also gently waved his hand and used Sword Realm to seal the surrounding space, creating a completely undisturbed battle environment for the two of them. Under the cover of Sword Realm, Qin Kunlun and Zhang Mingfeng's battle couldn't affect the outside world. In this way, the two of them could naturally fight without any scruples. Chapter 2258. Tsang Xing immediately arranged a battle between the strong, which completely piqued everyone's interest. Under the cover of Xiao Chen's Sword Realm, Qin Kunlun and Zhang Mingfeng stood facing each other. Tsang Xing immediately arranged a battle between the strong, which completely piqued everyone's interest. Under the cover of Xiao Chen's Sword Realm, Qin Kunlun and Zhang Mingfeng stood facing each other. Feeling the mysteries of the Sword Realm, the two of them couldn't help but exclaim inwardly. Although Xiao Chen's Sword Realm didn't have the slightest hostility towards them, the two of them clearly knew that with a single thought from Xiao Chun, the two of them wouldn't have the slightest ability to retaliate within the sword realm. Needless to say, the strength of the sword realm naturally didn't need to be mentioned. Unfortunately, the two of them couldn't comprehend the sword realm because they didn't possess a sword body. Hence, they were destined to be unable to control the sword realm. After secretly experiencing the mysteries of the sword realm, the two of them turned their gazes towards each other. As their eyes met, a faint smile appeared on Qin Kunlun's face as he spoke. "Junior brother Zhang, we haven't fought for a year, right? To be exact, it's been a year and 3 months." Hearing this, Zhang Mingfeng replied in a deep voice. Naturally, Zhang Mingfeng and Qin Kunlun had fought many times. As the number 1 core disciple, Qin Kunlun was obviously the target that many disciples in the sword sect wanted to surpass. Naturally, Zhang Mingfeng was the same. However, it was a pity that even though Zhang Mingfeng had challenged Qin Kunlun countless times, he was defeated every time. In front of Zhang Mingfeng, Qin Kunlun was like an insurmountable mountain that stood horizontally in front of him. Hearing Zhang Mingfeng's words, Qin Kunlun's smile didn't diminish as he said, "In that case, does junior brother Zhang still want to fight?" "Yes." As he spoke, the storage ring in Zhang Mingfeng's hand flashed, and a long sword appeared in his hand. At the same time, a soaring battle intent instantly erupted from within Zhang Mingfeng's body. He knew that Qin Kunlun's strength was very strong, to the point of being abnormal. In the entire sword sect, only the number 2 core disciple, Li Suifeng, could threaten Qin Kunlun. But even so, Zhang Mingfeng still wanted to fight. Losing without a fight was not Zhang Mingfeng's character. Sensing Zhang Mingfeng's overflowing fighting intent, Qin Kunlun smiled and said, "In that case, come at me." As soon as he finished speaking, Zhang Mingfeng no longer hesitated. He took a step forward and instantly appeared in front of Qin Kunlun. He suddenly slashed out with the long sword in his hand. Terrifying sword Qi tore through the air and slashed towards Qin Kunlun. That's right. Zhang Mingfeng's cultivation had already reached the small perfection of the comprehension realm. He was only a step away from the great perfection realm. Seeing Zhang Mingfeng make his move, the few core disciples below also said with respect, "Looks like senior brother Zhang will be able to break through to the complete comprehension realm soon." Zhang Mingfeng's improvement was indeed great. Everyone felt that with Zhang Mingfeng's current cultivation, even if he could not defeat Qin Kunlun, he would not be too much weaker than Qin Kunlun. Just when everyone was looking forward to a fierce battle, Qin Kunlun did not dodge Zhang Mingfeng's sword. He only stretched out 2 fingers. With a muffled sound, Zhang Mingfeng's sword was blocked by Qin Kunlun's 2 fingers under the crowd's incredulous gaze. The 2 fingers seemed to be casually pinching Zhang Mingfeng's long sword, but Zhang Mingfeng clearly felt that the 2 fingers were like 2 mountains, preventing his long sword from moving forward. Not bad. Your cultivation is about to break through to the complete comprehension realm. Your sword chi has also increased a lot. Looks like junior brother Zhang did not slack off in the past year. Qin Kunlun laughed softly as he praised Zhang Mingfeng. However, Zhang Mingfeng's expression was ugly with regards to this. He had indeed not relaxed even a little during this 1 year. However, so what? The gap between him and Qin Kunlun had still not closed. He originally thought that he had at least caught up to Qin Kunlun, but now it seemed that he had not. As his voice fell, Qin Kunlun flicked his finger. Zhang Mingfeng was involuntarily pushed back a few steps. At the same time, Qin Kunlun also revealed his appearance. With the long sword in his hand, Qin Kunlun's aura underwent a huge change. He was domineering and awe-inspiring, like the Kunlun Mountains, causing people to be intimidated. At this moment, Qin Kunlun, with the long sword in his hand, gave people such a feeling. No one could understand the pressure that Qin Kunlun gave people more than Zhang Mingfeng. Just by standing in front of Qin Kunlun, Zhang Mingfeng felt as if he was a small boat drifting in the stormy sea, as if he would be overturned by the huge waves at any time. Forcefully withstanding the huge pressure that Qin Kunlun gave him, Zhang Mingfeng raised his head and looked straight at Qin Kunlun. At this moment, the smile on Qin Kunlun's face had disappeared. His expression was dignified, like a king between heaven and earth. Junior brother Zhang, come and try my sword. Kunlun's sword technique. As he spoke, Qin Kunlun's sword slashed down in an extremely ordinary manner. However, just this one slash made Zhang Mingfeng feel that his hair stood on end and his back was unconsciously eroded by cold sweat. The sword had not yet arrived, but the terrifying pressure was already pressing down on Zhang Mingfeng, making it difficult for him to breathe. Facing his scalp, Zhang Mingfeng raised his sword to block. However, when the two collided, Zhang Mingfeng was like a kite with a broken string, and he was directly sent flying. One slash, just one slash, and Zhang Mingfeng was defeated. Looking at Qin Kunlun, who was standing below with a sword in his hand like an emperor, Xiao Chun, who was in the sky, smiled faintly. This boy is not bad. Xiao Chun actually praised Qin Kunlun personally. Hearing this, Nangong Guan and the others on the side also smiled and echoed. He is indeed not bad. This boy has quite a deep understanding of the monarch sword Dao. When he slashed down with his sword, the power was overwhelming. Before the fight even started, his opponent was already terrified. Xiao Chun and the others were at a very high level, and their eyesight was also very experienced. With a single glance, they could tell that Qin Kunlun was walking on the monarch sword Dao. With one slash, the world lost its color. Qin Kunlun had indeed comprehended the essence of the monarch sword Dao, and Zhang Mingfeng's defeat was understandable. The outcome of the fight had been decided, and Qin Kunlun did not continue to attack. Although Zhang Mingfeng still had the strength to fight, the two of them were brothers from the same sect, and there was no need for them to fight to the death. Putting his sword back into its scabbard, Qin Kunlun's face once again revealed a faint smile. He looked at Zhang Mingfeng and said, "Junior brother Zhang, thank you for letting me win. Senior brother, you don't have to be like this. My skills are inferior, and I'm not far from losing." Zhang Mingfeng was not a sore loser. Since Qin Kunlun was stronger than him, his loss was his loss. Zhang Mingfeng had no complaints in his heart. Of course, this failure also made Zhang Mingfeng secretly swear that he would work hard in his cultivation in the future. Sooner or later, he would surpass Qin Kunlun. Looking at Zhang Mingfeng's expression that was still full of fighting spirit, Li Ku, who had been quiet all this time, said with a smile, "This boy is also a talent that can be molded. It seems that our sword sect is full of crouching tigers and hidden dragons. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendation." Chapter 2259. Although Zhang Mingfeng was defeated, he still received Li Ku's praise. He didn't get angry because he was defeated by Qin Kunlun. Instead, he calmly admitted his defeat. Such a temperament was indeed good. After hearing Li Ku's words, Zhou Song laughed and scolded. "You only know now? Who asked you to not care about the sex matters at all?" Li Ku was a bit of a loner, so he usually didn't care about the sword sex matters. Unless it was Xiao Chen's order, Li Ku basically wouldn't take the initiative to do anything. After being scolded by Zhou Song, Li Ku didn't refute. Immediately after, Song Xing announced Qin Kunlun's victory, and the first battle ended. There were a total of 30 people present, and each of them had to fight against the other 29 people. Therefore, Song Xing immediately announced the second battle. The two sides of the battle were announced by Song Xing. Of course, there would be a special person in charge of recording the results. One battle after another passed. One had to admit that the 30 disciples present weren't weak, as they were able to pass the first round of the test. Especially Xiao Wan. Although she was the only inner disciple present, she didn't lose a single battle after 3 consecutive battles. Xiao Chen wasn't surprised by Xiao Wan's combat strength. It was normal for Xiao Wan to have the combat strength of a core disciple. If it wasn't for Xiao Wan's desire to be promoted to a core disciple through her own efforts, she would have already been promoted to a core disciple with her status. However, the others weren't as calm as Xiao Chun. After 3 rounds of the competition, everyone present didn't dare to underestimate Xiao Wan anymore. They originally thought that Xiao Wan could reach this stage with her status as an inner disciple. Perhaps it was because of her status or because of the treasures that Xiao Chang gave her. But now, it seemed that Xiao Wan relied entirely on her own strength to reach this stage. Based on the strength that Xiao Wan displayed so far, she was already considered the top among the core disciples. This was because in the 3 consecutive battles, Xiao Wan basically defeated her opponents with a single sword strike. Our young lady is not weak. Even Qin Kunlun couldn't help but glance at Xiao Wan with a smile on his face. In terms of looks, Xiao Wan and Lu Qingyao were on par. In terms of strength, it was difficult for Qin Kunlun to see through Xiao Wan. After all, Xiao Wan had not really fought before. She had a heaven-defying background, high talent, and unparalleled beauty. It could be said that Xiao Wan was a perfect woman. It was no wonder that even Qin Kunlun could not help but pay attention to her. The competition continued one after another. At this time, the 30 people present had basically widened the gap between them. For example, Qin Kunlun, Li Suifeng, Lu Qingyao, Xiao Wan, and the others were still undefeated. They were basically guaranteed to be in the top 10. After Qin Kunlun defeated another opponent, Song Xing immediately announced the start of the next match. Lu Qingyao versus Xiao Wan. Along with Song Xing's announcement, everyone was stunned. Qin Kunlun also revealed a meaningful smile. Interesting. Xiao Wan and Lu Qingyao were the 2 beauties of the sword sect. They did not have much interaction before, but this would be the first time they fought. After hearing Song Xing's announcement, Lu Qingyao and Xiao Wan went up to the stage at the same time. Lu Qingyao's expression was calm. Even though she knew Xiao Wan's identity, she did not intend to go easy on her. Similarly, facing Lu Qingyao, Xiao Wan's eyes flashed with a trace of battle intent. She knew that Lu Qingyao was very strong and was completely different from her previous opponents. "Senior sister, please." Xiao Wan took out her sword and said indifferently, "Senior sister, please." Lu Qingyao did not have the slightest bit of carelessness. In response, Lu Qingyao also drew her long sword and calmly replied, "I'm coming." After saying that, Lu Qingyao directly stabbed out with her sword. This sword was very fast, so fast that no one could see its trajectory. It appeared in front of Xiao Wan out of thin air. Xiao Wan narrowed her eyes and immediately raised her sword to block. The 2 long swords collided and produced a muffled sound. However, from just one exchange, it could be seen that both of them were very strong. Lu Qingyao was able to become the 3rd core disciple of the sword sect. She definitely did not rely on her appearance. She indeed had the strength to do so. However, facing Lu Qingyao, Xiao Wan was not to be outdone. Looking at the intense battle between the 2 women, Qin Kunlun commented softly, "It seems that young lady's strength is enough to enter the top 5. In Qin Kunlun's opinion, Xiao Wan's strength was enough to enter the top 5 core disciples. She was even stronger than Zhang Mingfeng. As soon as she finished speaking, the battle between the 2 women entered its climax. Lu Qingyao did not have the slightest intention of showing mercy. It was obvious that she was going all out and did not go easy on Xiao Wan just because of her identity. After a fierce battle, Lu Qingyao's attacks didn't diminish. At the same time, she looked at Xiao Wan and said indifferently, "Junior sister Xiao, you're strong enough to enter the top 5 core disciples. But it's a pity that you're still not my match." Lu Qingyao said, and the sword in her hand flashed in a pale blue radiance. At the same time, waves of mysterious energy gradually emerged around Lu Qingyao. Upon sensing the changes in Lu Qingyao, Xiao Wan knitted her brows slightly. At this moment, Xiao Wan sensed an extremely dangerous aura from Lu Qingyao. Junior sister Lu. Qin Kunlun also witnessed the changes in Lu Qingyao and shook his head helplessly with a bitter smile. Of course, he knew what Lu Qingyao was going to do. Qin Kunlun, who had fought with Lu Qingyao countless times, knew her strength and means very well. Seeing that Lu Qingyao even used her trump card, Qin Kunlun felt helpless. With Lu Qingyao's current results, even if she lost to Xiao Wan, she would still be able to enter the top 10. However, Lu Qingyao didn't want to lose. As for the reason, Qin Kunlun had already guessed it. He lifted his head and gazed at the imposing figure in the sky. Perhaps it was because of this person that Lu Qingyao wanted to win so badly. Qin Kunlun's guess was right. It was because of Xiao Chun that Lu Qingyao didn't want to lose, even if her opponent was Xiao Wan. Lu Qingyao's gaze was incomparably firm. Her aura surged continuously, and she swore in her heart, "I just want to be closer to you." With this thought in mind, Lu Qingyao slashed her sword and said softly, "Junior sister Xiao, be careful. Flowing waterfall." Lu Qingyao said and slashed her sword. In an instant, spiritual energy rushed toward Xiao Wan like raging waves, as though they were going to drown Xiao Wan. Please add me to your collection. Please recommend me. Just when everyone thought that an earth-shattering battle was about to break out, no one expectedly Sui Feng to suddenly speak to Xiao Chun in the sky. Sect leader, can I admit defeat? Qin Kunlun is a freak. It's too tiring to fight with him. Admit defeat? Li Suifeng actually admitted defeat before the battle even started. Moreover, judging from his lazy look, it was obvious that he didn't intend to fight with Qin Kunlun from the beginning. However, it's fine if you admit defeat, but the reason you gave is that it's too tiring. Because Qin Kunlun was powerful, Li Suifeng felt that it was too tiring and directly admitted defeat. After hearing Li Suifeng's words, even Qin Kunlun revealed a bitter smile. Then, he lifted his head to look at Xiao Chun in the sky and waited for Xiao Chen's reply. Under their gazes, Xiao Chun laughed heartily and said, "Haha, interesting. There are no rules and you can't admit defeat. Of course, I don't have any objections." Xiao Chun was quite surprised by Li Suifeng's character. Li Suifeng revealed a smile when he heard Xiao Chen's words. After which, he looked at Qin Kunlun and laughed. Since sect leader doesn't have any objections, it's settled then. Senior brother Qin, you will still be number 1, and I will be number 2. I admit defeat. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. If you don't follow me, who else is worthy of following? In Qin Kunlun's opinion, he was the only one in the entire sword sect who was worthy of the first sword. The others were not worthy of the first sword at all. Similarly, the same logic applied. There were countless treasured swords in the sword sect, but only the first sword was worthy of Qin Kunlun. With that, Qin Kunlun suddenly shouted, "Rise." Then, he exerted force and pulled the first sword out from the ground. The peerless sword that had been buried for countless years finally blossomed in Qin Kunlun's hand. The blade trembled violently, and the soil that covered the sword fell off. As the soil fell, a dazzling golden radiance erupted from the first sword. It was so blinding that one couldn't open one's eyes. The golden radiance was like the sun. Even the disciples outside the burial sword valley saw the golden radiance, and many of them exclaimed in astonishment. Some of the disciples didn't know what was going on, but the elder in charge of guarding the entrance of the burial sword valley knew what was going on. The 10 children's swords have appeared. The 10 children's swords had appeared. Qin Kunlun had successfully pulled out the first sword, and the first sword had also recognized him. As the golden radiance gradually dissipated, everyone in the valley finally saw the true appearance of the first sword. It was an ancient golden sword that was held in Qin Kunlun's hand. As though it was born to be the king of weapons, the first sword gave off an extremely domineering and majestic feeling. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. In a chapter, he said with a smile. Junior brotherly, let senior brother help you try and see if the second sword is as lazy as you. Or is it just an undeserved reputation? Although Li Suifeng was lazy, his strength was not to be underestimated. However, the second sword was ordinary and did not look like a peerless treasure sword at all. In the face of Qin Kunlun's sudden attack, Li Suifeng did not bat an eyelid. He also slashed out with his sword. Then the second sword and the first sword collided fiercely. When the two swords collided, a rich golden light and sharp sword qi immediately gushed out from the first sword. However, in the face of the power of the first sword, the second sword only had a trace of faint green light. At a glance, the two swords were not at the same level at all. Even some of the core disciples at the side could not help but say, "Will it be cut in half by the first sword?" Everyone was sweating profusely for the second sword. However, the scene that everyone imagined did not appear. After a head-on collision, the second sword was actually unscathed. Just this point alone was enough to prove that it was extraordinary. It should be known that if an ordinary treasure sword dared to go head-on against the first sword, it would probably have been cut in half by the first sword. However, the second sword was not affected at all. There was not even a scratch on it. After a head-on collision, Qin Kunlun did not attack again. Instead, he took the initiative to step forward and look curiously at the second sword in Li Suifeng's hand. He clicked his tongue in wonder. This sword is a perfect match for Junior Brother. Not bad, not bad. It's definitely not inferior to my first sword. Qin Kunlun's eyesight was very sharp. He quickly saw that, although the second sword was not obvious, it was not inferior to the first sword at all. Perhaps it was because of Li Suifeng's words that it was not bad to be the second sword. In the face of Qin Kunlun's praise, Li Suifeng pursed his lips helplessly and said, "I say, senior brother, can you not suddenly attack in the future? It's so scary." Qin Kunlun and Li Suifeng both received the recognition of the 10 children's swords. Next, Lu Qinyao, Zhang Mingfeng, Xiao Wan, and the others all tried. In the end, the 10 children's swords also acknowledged them one after another. The recognition of the 10 children's swords also meant that the former 10 disciples of the sword sect had returned once again. Xiao Chun, who had been watching this scene, smiled even more brightly at this time. It had to be said that Qin Kunlun and the others' performance made Xiao Chun very gratified. They did not waste the sword sect's great efforts in nurturing them, nor did they waste the various cultivation resources and cultivation mystic realms provided by the sword sect every month. The 10 children's swords had all recognized their masters, so the selection of the 10 disciples of the sword freaks should also be announced. End realm experts in this small world zest. There weren't many small worlds that could have an end realm expert. There were only a few that were known, and they could be counted on one's fingers. As for Emperor realm experts, they weren't something that small world could have. Because the world energy and heavenly Tao laws in a minor thousand world were far inferior to those in the great thousand world, it was impossible to break through to the Emperor realm in a minor thousand world. Previously, all the emperors who had appeared in the minor thousand worlds had come from the great thousand world. No emperor had ever completed a breakthrough in a minor thousand world. However, even if it wasn't an emperor, an end realm expert already made Li Suifeng feel that something was wrong. Perhaps this new small world wasn't as simple as he thought. Li Suifeng's gaze was solemn as he looked at the spatial tunnel in the sky. Very quickly, the spatial tunnel was completely formed. At the same time, dozens of warriors wearing the same uniform walked out of the spatial tunnel in a single file. Their leader was a skinny old man. The aura of an end realm expert came from this thin and weak old man. Once they entered the great world, a look of excitement appeared on their faces. A middle-aged man couldn't help but excitedly say to the old man in the lead, Old ancestor, the spiritual energy of this world is really dense. That's right. It's much stronger than our flaming wind world. From the words of this group of people, it was not difficult to deduce that the small thousand world they were in was a place called the flaming wind world. This flaming wind world had obviously never appeared in the Great Thousand World, and it was very likely that it had just connected to the Great Thousand World. Therefore, this group of people didn't know much about the Great World and didn't know how terrifying it was. While these people were chatting, the old man in the lead quickly noticed Li Suifeng, who was not far away. His gaze fell on Li Suifeng, and a look of surprise flashed across the old man's eyes. He said, "To have the cultivation of great perfection of the comprehension realm at such a young age, this, as an end realm expert, the old man could easily see Li Suifeng's cultivation. However, what shocked him was Li Suifeng's age. He could tell that Li Suifeng was definitely not young. To be able to reach the great perfection of the comprehension realm at such a young age, such a genius was unheard of in the flaming wind world." Immediately, the old man led his people towards Li Suifeng. Soon the two sides met. Looking at Li Suifeng, the old man said with a smile, "Little guy, your talent is not bad." Perhaps it was because he loved talents, but looking at Li Suifeng in front of him, the old man actually had the thought of taking him under his wing.